There are moments when life disguises lessons as tests, when power dresses itself as kindness, and when the richest man in the room finally learns what it means to be poor in spirit. Tonight, you will hear of a billionaire who trusted 3 women with his fortune, but only one spent it on something he could never buy. He was a man whose name alone could open doors faster than prayers. In the glass towers of the city, his signature shimmered on buildings, hospitals, and foundations. They called him Alexander Quinn, the man who built an empire on precision. But precision is a dangerous god. It teaches the heart to measure what should only be felt. Alexander believed in control. He owned art that others called priceless, not because he loved beauty, but because beauty obeyed him. Every detail of his life, from the marble veins in his penthouse floors to the exact angle of his coffee cup, spoke of one truth: everything had to be accounted for. And yet, beneath the symphony of success, there was a silence he could not explain. A silence that began after the funeral of his father. The old man had been a factory worker who left him a single sentence in his will: "When you learn what money can't fix, you'll finally understand what wealth is." For years, Alexander considered it nonsense. He was certain that there was no such thing as a problem money couldn't solve, only people too weak to use it properly. But time, as it often does, began to whisper otherwise. At 48, unmarried, surrounded by admirers, Alexander felt the slow corrosion of certainty. It began in small ways: the laughter of people that didn't reach their eyes, the applause that felt rehearsed, the emptiness of rooms that cost millions but echoed like tombs. And then the dream recurring stubborn. In it he saw 3 doors, one of gold, one of glass, and one of wood. Behind each door a woman waited. But every time he opened one, the others vanished, and when he turned around, his reflection was gone. He awoke one night from that dream, sweating and disoriented. The city glittered beneath him like spilled diamonds, and he suddenly realized he didn't know which woman beside him truly saw him. His fiancée Elara slept soundly, a vision of curated perfection, every strand of hair in place. She had beauty that seemed designed for flash photography, not for quiet mornings. She said she loved him, and perhaps she did, the way a flame loves the air that feeds it. Then there was his executive assistant Vanessa, sharp, loyal, tireless. She managed his world like a chessboard, anticipating every move before he thought it. Alexander admired her efficiency, but he often wondered, was it loyalty or ambition that fueled her devotion? And finally, unseen yet always there, was Maria, his maid. She moved through the mansion like time itself, silent, necessary, unnoticed. For 8 years she'd prepared his breakfast, cleaned his trophies, and left without a word. Alexander knew little about her except take advances in pay. When he once asked her why, she had only smiled faintly and said, "Sir, I take what I need. No more." He remembered that answer because no one else had ever said such a thing to him. That morning, as sunlight spilled through the penthouse glass, Alexander found himself staring at a newspaper headline about a stolen fortune and a deceitful lover. He folded the paper slowly. A strange, almost childish thought entered his mind. Would they still love me without money? The thought stayed. It followed him into board meetings, into car rides, into sleepless nights. And one dawn, over untouched coffee, he decided he wanted proof. Not in words, not in promises, but in action. He called his personal banker and ordered 3 identical platinum cards. Each bore his name, Quinn. He wrote nothing on them, no limits, no restrictions. Then he called for Elara, Vanessa, and Maria. They arrived at different times. Elara came first, radiant, curious, still half-dressed in elegance even in the early hour. Vanessa followed, tablet in hand, expression composed, always ready for a task. Maria came last, hesitant, her uniform slightly faded from years of washing. Alexander stood before them in his living room, where glass walls framed a skyline worth billions. He looked at the 3 women, symbols of his life, love, power, and humility, and smiled faintly. "This isn't a gift," he said quietly. "It's a test of trust. Each of you will receive my card for one day. No limits. No supervision. Spend it however you wish. I won't ask for justification, only honesty." Elara's eyes lit up like champagne. Vanessa's brows furrowed with suspicion. Maria lowered her gaze, unsure if she had heard correctly. Alexander handed. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Bring me the receipts. Not to prove your spending, but to show me your choices. He didn't explain further. He wanted their instincts, not their strategies. As they left one by one, the silence in the penthouse deepened again. Alexander looked out at the city and felt something he hadn't felt in years: anticipation. Not the anticipation of profit or acquisition, but of revelation. He poured himself a glass of water, stared at his reflection, and muttered the words his father had once written. "When you learn what money can't fix." His reflection said nothing back. That night, he stood alone on his balcony as clouds began to gather over the city. 3 women now carried pieces of his empire in their purses. One would spend it on beauty, one would spend it on ambition, and one perhaps on something that would cost him everything he thought he knew. The wind rose softly. Below him the city lights flickered like small hearts, beating in the dark, waiting to be tested. And in that moment Alexander Quinn smiled, unaware that for others was, in truth, the test that would measure his own soul. In the pale luxury of morning, Elara stood before a mirror as if the city itself had arranged the light to honor her. The card lay on the vanity like a small silver permission slip for destiny. She had always believed that love had to be seen to be safe, and that safety wore diamonds like armor. Today would be proof of adoration, of inevitability, of a future sealed not by vows but by a glare strong enough to blind doubt. She moved through the penthouse with the grace of a practiced arrival. Cameras were unnecessary. She carried an audience in her mind, the invisible multitude that rewards the beautiful for staying beautiful. Outside, a chauffeur waited. The elevator accepted her with soft obedience. The city unscrolled. Avenues like catwalks, glass-fronted temples of taste, the accurate hum of a metropolis rehearsed for wealth. The first purchase was time disguised as fabric. A couture house opened early for her, the lights still yawning awake, the mannequins modest in linen veils. There were gowns that had taken months of needles and prayers, panels of silk that altered breath, beadwork that made light kneel. Elara touched them all and understood the old arithmetic. If the world would measure her by what she wore, she would become a measurement that could not be contested. She chose a dress the color of dawn seen through crystal, a quiet, ruinous thing that pretended not to know its own power. She paid for an entire team to rush a second skin of it, one for the rehearsal dinner, one for the ceremony, because memory like a gallery benefits from curation. The card sang once. The receipt printed like a small snowfall, but dresses alone were a language without verbs. She added motion. From the couturier she crossed to a jeweler where time lived in stones. The ring on her finger, already a promise large enough to be envied, became a proposal to rewrite brightness itself. She selected a band that braided meteors, a crescent of ice to flank the central diamond, so that any angle of the hand could talk. She acquired earrings, then a tiara crafted from frost that never melts, because a woman who comes from nowhere must carry her own heraldry. The card sang again. 2 songs, then a third, a chime that rinsed guilt into something perfumed. Across the street, a florist constructed climates to order. Elara purchased orchids flown overnight, cascade after cascade of pale planets, and peonies persuaded out of season with heat and indifference, and lilacs harvested from a private estate where scent is managed like a secret. She reserved an entire greenhouse for a weekend, not because she needed that many flowers but because the word enough frightened her. If love is real, it deserves overuse. The card sang a hymn. Printers murmured. Someone bowed. The orchids looked like small arguments for eternity. She turned then to visibility. A luxury hotel, its lobby a well-dressed hush, its carpets absorbing the misunderstandings which accepted a booking that was not a booking but a declaration. Elara purchased the rooftop for a night and the ballroom for a day and the bar for the between hours when joy smears into hunger. She bought the rights to a playlist and the effort of a renowned chef, a tasting menu arranged to rehearse desire and fulfillment in 7 courses. She ordered dessert to replicate the skyline in sugar, each building a shard of sweetness that would be destroyed cleanly by forks. The card sang a little louder. The ledger smiled. A server somewhere thought of rent. Attention accompanied her like perfume. By noon, the concierge had begun to address her by another name in secret, not Elara, but Future. People smiled in that exported way expensive places teach you to smile, precise, deferential, useful. Doors open because doors are ambitious. Elevators moved as if the floors themselves petitioned for contact. She did not feel adored, she felt arranged. On the way to a private salon, she reconfigured loyalty. She purchased hair and face like a musician rents an orchestra. Colorists, facialists, technicians of shine. Contracts went out for a bridal content team. She reserved a cinematographer whose work made memory look like prophecy. She paid deposits for aerial shots, for a drone to receive evening light like a sacrament, for licensing fees to borrow a favorite song's ache. She acquired embargo agreements to ensure exclusivity, because love that appears everywhere appears thin. The card sang. The receipts stacked. A polite printer suggested its paper was low, and new paper arrived as if manifesting from the idea of her. Then came the charity, as obligatory in her world as dessert. Elara believed in giving the way a stage believes in curtains, as a necessary gesture that completes the performance. She called a foundation and purchased a table at their gala, but a table is merely a place to sit. She bought a title, a headline, a line of gratitude in the program that would eclipse other names like a lavish cloud. She underwrote the floral arch at the entrance, not in her name exactly, but in the name of a future she intended to place on every tongue. In the afternoon, a draft arrived for approval. This evening is brought to you by the generosity of. She corrected a preposition so her name would fall closer to his. The card sang with a different pitch, almost human. There were gifts that looked like kindness. She sent designer handbags to friends who had posted the right congratulations, shoes to acquaintances whose admiration she needed to mature into allegiance, spa days for bridesmaids carefully selected for their photogenic warmth. Each generosity had a shadow called strategy. The packages left the boutique as if they possessed independent destinies. Gratitude texts would arrive like sparrows. Screens would glow. Reputation that great garden had been watered. At a quiet moment she remembered her mother. For a heartbeat, a rural kitchen breathed in the back of her mind. Steam climbing from a chipped kettle, the clock practicing patience, a window framing a field that never obeyed fashion. Elara placed a call to a bank and redeemed a mortgage in full. The number was not large compared to the 3 that had already been spent on fabric and light. The clerk, polite and professional, asked for confirmation. Papers moved across a desk somewhere. A woman in a small house would one day check her mail and find her life newly possible. The card sang a small, honest note, and for an instant Elara felt something like relief or hunger or both. But softness, when it cannot be public, grows confused. The moment withered under the weight of the afternoon's obligations. She pivoted back to the world that understands proof better than tenderness. A luxury car showroom accepted her in the way chapels accept a bride, softly, already sure. She ordered a limited edition convertible in a white so pure it accused other whites of laziness. She commissioned a plate number that nested meaning into numerals only a few would decode. She purchased a second car for weekend drives, to summarize breeze and applause, and a third, small and perfect, as a gift for herself that would never leave the garage but would photograph beautifully beside the dress. The card sang and finally paused to breathe. Salespeople arranged champagne that tasted like compliance. Still, something in her remained unsatisfied, as if the choreography had not yet earned its final pirouette. She needed permanence, a way to make the air acknowledge her even when she was absent. On a boulevard where money had trained beauty to sit and behave, she found a gallery that sold time. In it, canvases waited with the stillness of patience. Sculptures practiced gravity, photographs pretended to be windows. Elara purchased a piece not because it touched her but because it had touched the right rooms. She bought another because its artist was dead and therefore more reliable. She arranged a loan to a museum for the season of her wedding so that brochures would memorize her surname, and the docents would say it daily like prayer. The card sang, and a curator's smile added a decade to her perceived importance. She ate at 3 in the afternoon, a salad that performed humility, then a dessert that apologized for it. She scrolled through headlines that would soon be hers, through faces that would turn toward her at the gala, through the map of a world that could be navigated by a woman who refused to appear lost. She saw herself walking down a hallway of murmurs, her dress educating the air, the ring flicking small lightning, the orchestra playing a song that translates wealth into confidence. She saw Alexander at the end of that hallway, not a man but an arrival. She considered the test again. She thought of honesty and decided that honesty is what a person becomes when she can afford the truth. Evening pulled its blue sleeve over the city. Elara gathered the day like a bouquet, gowns and orchids, ceilings and headlines, cars and arrangements, friends packaged as an audience, charity draped in her consonants, art that would carry her forward 3 inches taller. She returned to the penthouse with the receipts bound in order, their edges aligned, the total a number that implied fate. She placed them in a leather folder as if tucking a child to bed. Before sleep, she visited the hotel rooftop she had purchased for a Wednesday because she disliked Thursdays. The air smelled like money after rain. Down below, others kept moving, the blessed ordinary, windows lit like minor constellations. She stepped to the edge and let her eyes travel to the part of the horizon where distance performs patience. Somewhere, a woman who looked like her without cosmetics was washing dishes and adding 2 and 4 and arriving at 7. Somewhere a florist was mopping. Somewhere, a seamstress was taking a bus home with her fingers still vibrating from silk. Elara did not disdain them, she simply did not know how to include them in the version of love she understood. When she finally lay in bed, her phone illuminated with confirmations. The app for the card showed transactions like footsteps across a critical day. The numbers did not frighten her. They formed a sentence she had always wanted to print. This is how much I am worth to the story. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the earlier kitchen again. The kettle, the window, the field. It came obedient but faint, like a memory of someone else's dream. Late that night, alone again, she stood at her window as the city rehearsed sleep. The card rested on her palm, a square of consequence. Somewhere below this altitude, life continued without lenses. A siren practiced urgency. A bus rehearsed endurance. A child negotiated with midnight. Elara pressed the card to her wrist and felt nothing move but her pulse. She whispered a promise to herself that was neither vow nor threat. Tomorrow she would make sure the right photographs found the right eyes. Tomorrow she would turn love into a calendar. Tomorrow, if necessary, she would redeem another mortgage for another mother and keep it just as small. For now she believed she had given proof, and proof is all some religions require. Morning opened like a curtain and revealed what performance leaves behind. Sequins on a floor, perfume in air that does not belong to anyone, a silence practicing how to sound expensive. In that silence, the city prepared itself to watch, and Elara prepared herself to be watched. The binder of receipts rested on marble, as if marble were paper's natural habitat. She had arranged the pages by category the way a conductor arranges sections of an orchestra. Strings of couture, brass of jewels, percussion of cars, woodwinds of flowers, and the small, nearly shy solo of a mortgage redeemed far from the symphony's center. Some days acquire meaning through the friction of consequences. This day gathered its meaning through the ease with which doors complied. The rooftop she had reserved inhaled the sky until the horizon tilted in her favor. The hotel ballroom rearranged its chandeliers to pour light in flattering angles. The florist's greenhouse emptied into vans as if a climate had been invited to attend. By noon the city itself seemed to bend, 1 degree at a time, toward a single premise, that beauty proves sincerity if you can afford enough of it. Elara watched the proof assembling. Stylists curated hair that belonged to photographs more than to hours. The dress traveled in a garment case that resembled an argument for forgiveness. Jewelers' boxes opened and closed like polite secrets. Emails confirmed loan agreements for art that would stand in a museum and say her surname without moving its mouth. She filed confirmations into a tidy folder of consequence. The folder acquired a weight that suggested future. But judgment had already begun, not in words and not in any human mouth. It began in the quiet ledger of cause and effect. When the skyline-shaped dessert arrived to rehearse its unveiling, the pastry chef's apprentice stayed behind to repair a lopsided tower with bare fingers that would later carry boxes onto a subway. In a boutique, a seamstress fainted briefly and woke embarrassed, then worked an extra hour to make up for a minute she lost to weakness. In a florist's van, a boy inhaled too much pollen and sneezed until his supervisor remembered the boy's name and handed him water without ceremony. None of these things argued against extravagance. They simply added themselves, small, honest, inconvenient. By afternoon, Elara's choices had achieved their intention. The city had a new rumor. Headlines prepared to imagine her generously. A publicist's draft arranged adjectives around her like furniture. Photographers sharpened their lenses, then sharpened their questions about angles. Invitations sailed like silver birds toward inboxes where people measured their acceptance not by delight, but by proximity to light. Elara stood in the middle of her arrangements and felt the faintest tug of something uncurated. It arrived when a courier asked for an extra minute to rest his shoulder and apologize for needing a body. It arrived when the seam of a second gown whispered resistance and required a woman's steady, invisible patience to agree with it. It arrived when the charity's event coordinator emailed to confirm the spelling of names for the donor wall, and a list of those names appeared. People who had given quietly for years and those who had given loudly for a week. It arrived when she read the list twice and recognized exactly no one outside her circle and his. The rooftop rehearsal began at golden hour, a time invented for persuasion. The city sat below like a loyal empire, and the air, newly purchased for a night, wore music as if music were a form of weather. Staff moved with the elegance of well-paid choreography. Orchids cascaded from railings, their pale faces practicing eternity. Crystal glassware performed precision. Elara walked through this theater and tried to hear the future applauding. The applause came on time. It just sounded thinner than she expected. She did not notice a camera at first, it was too good at being invisible. A content team she had commissioned had arrived early to harvest candor. Candor, properly harvested, becomes the most delicious lie. They captured a hand resting near a jeweled glass, a turn of the neck that caused light to bless bone, a dress entering a frame as if the frame were lucky. They captured generosity in motion, the quiet scroll of a pledge to the Gala Foundation, a handwritten note placed carefully beside a check, flowers being signed for by men who would never smell them again. They captured a woman in the middle of proof. Night arrived with the softness of money. The rooftop's edge traded distance for intimacy. Skyscrapers leaned closer to admire themselves in each other. The playlist she had licensed made old love stories behave like new. The skyline dessert, unveiled, made the city briefly eat itself and call the cannibalism charming. Friends collected into warm shapes and practiced laughter that photographs could use without captions. Gratitude flowed in reasonable quantities. Elara felt, for a moment, the satisfaction she had budgeted for. She had delivered scale. She had delivered a feeling that could be posted. Judgment, which prefers to act privately, moved elsewhere. In a small kitchen across town, a woman opened her mail and discovered that something impossible had happened. The mortgage letter announced a 0 with a finality rare in this world. The woman touched the paper as if it might bruise, then placed it on the table and placed her hand over it, and then removed her hand and looked at it again, as if her palm could be educated by proximity to relief. She did not know who to thank. She whispered anyway into an empty room that did not mind. That whisper went nowhere official. Changed nothing on the internet. But the air near the ceiling knew something had been lifted, and the ceiling, which had learned to keep secrets, kept this one gently. At the same hour, Elara's rooftop glittered its way through a song transition. In the museum, a curator rechecked the label that would associate an artist's silence with Elara's newly minted eminence. He stood in the ambient hush that museums breed and let his eyes rest on the piece. The piece remained indifferent. Art does not care about patrons, art respects time. He approved the label and imagined the next board meeting where a name would secure a small victory for relevance. He sent a thank you email and received an automated response. Two systems, both efficient, applauded each other. Back on the rooftop, a breeze misbehaved and pushed an orchid strand into a guest's glass. Laughter accepted the accident. Staff apologized in a tone that made apology sound like a luxury. Elara moved through it all with the serenity of someone who had done her part and expected the world to do the rest. She thought about the test again and found herself unafraid. What she had built today could not be argued with. It could be disliked only by those who disliked the obvious. She had invested in a chorus wide enough to drown doubt. She had included a small kindness to keep her symmetry. In a high corner of the night, a memory waited. It was the kitchen again. A chipped kettle, a square of sunlight practicing on laminate, a hummingbird of steam that belonged to a family. This time the memory refused perfect obedience. It shifted and showed not the room but the work that made the room possible. Hands, years, small resignations, and Elara felt her throat ask for water without moving her mouth. She drank Prosecco instead and resumed the necessary glow. The camera, which loves resolve, followed obediently. Hours dissolved into the expensive kind of fatigue that calls itself achievement. The rooftop exhaled its rented splendor back into the evening. The hotel staff restored their lobby to its usual arrangement of mute admiration. Vans returned their empty buckets to places where flowers would be reconsidered as inventory. The seamstress took a bus home in shoes that promised nothing. The pastry apprentice wrapped a burned finger and thought about how sugar can be cruel. The curator switched off a lamp and left a room full of objects that do not care who owns them. The mortgage letter lay on a kitchen table beneath a bowl of ordinary apples, becoming more real by sitting still. Elara returned to the penthouse carrying exhaustion the way a queen carries a train, gracefully, as if the weight were chosen. She set the binder beside a vase and let the city tuck itself around her. Screens awoke politely at her touch, showing placements secured, timelines engraved, confirmations behaving. She watched the numbers settle into a narrative the way birds settle into trees, neatly, as if trees had always meant to be chairs. Each transaction looked like a sentence that ended correctly. The page with the mortgage read like a corrected spelling inside a paragraph of eloquence. She felt the difference but did not have words for it. Judgment approached her not as lightning but as fog. It did not accuse, it asked to be considered. It arrived in the quiet echo of every purchase that had required applause to survive. It arrived in the way the orchids thanked only the flower budget and not the planet. It arrived in the silence after a song concluded, and no one noticed what the lyrics had requested of them. It arrived through the window where smaller lives continued, and buses resumed their difficult conversations with corners, and a siren practiced concern with imperfect sincerity, and a man in an elevator calculated whether to call his mother before it was too late to be appropriate. It arrived as a series of simple scenes that refused to look up at her. In the morning, light grew out of the river and climbed the glass until it reached her. The city yawned and returned to work. Elara prepared to present the binder again, not as pleading but as a summary. She smoothed her hair the way some people smooth secrets. She breathed as if oxygen had been curated for the appointment. She thought one last time about the test and decided she had answered its questions with competence. She considered the possibility that competence might be the wrong metric and declined it. The mirror agreed with her decision and reflected agreement handsomely. He received the binder the way fortune receives proof, with courtesy and a private calculation. No words were required for the transfer of pages from one certainty to another. In the quiet exchange, time performed a trick. It slowed enough for both to see themselves not as they were but as they hoped to be seen. The binder opened. The dress glowed on paper more obediently than it had on a body. The jewels sparkled in numbers. The rooftop thanked the invoice with a number that combined sky and staff into a three-dimensional receipt. The charity entry looked like virtue made legible. The gifts resembled influence practicing generosity. The art loan promised future enunciation in docent voices. The cars played at myth. The mortgage sat nearly invisible, humble and exact, like a small door that actually opens. Judgment, which never speaks during presentations, withheld itself. It waited inside the pause between page turns. It waited in the small shift of Elara's posture when the mortgage page faced daylight. It waited in the tiny contraction a pupil makes when it remembers distance. It waited in the room where wealth had learned to believe in itself. It waited, patient as wood, honest as gravity. Elara believed she had passed. She had not betrayed him, she told her body, she had crowned him. She had arranged a future where his name would travel further and return with interest. She had been strategic about generosity and generous about strategy. She had protected her own ascent without stealing. She had redeemed something for her mother and kept the kindness neat. She had done what the world teaches the ambitious to do: translate love into logistics. The day continued as if it were reasonable. Deliveries completed their destinies. Invoices found approval. Flowers died gracefully in their assigned vases. Social feeds began to glow with the particular light of curated happiness. Elara read the glow with satisfaction, and with an attention so exact it appeared casual. The comments, which are the oxygen of careful lives, arrived on time. She allowed herself a private smile that did not ask permission from mirrors toward dusk. The sky rehearsed intimacy again, and the city performed its old trick of pretending to be smaller than it is. Elara went back to the rooftop not to celebrate but to count. Counting is a ritual that calms the gifted. She counted the visible expressions of a love she understood. Places secured, names aligned, meals rehearsed, music licensed, angles learned, dresses obeyed, friends gathered. She counted to the edge of evening, and then stopped because the edge insisted on being the edge. A gust of wind lifted one strand of her hair and placed it briefly in front of her eyes. The world softened. The horizon lost its vocabulary. For a heartbeat long enough to be remembered, Elara saw the city without annotations. It was not a stage, not a ladder, not a mirror. It was a condition shared by millions of breathing humans, each carrying a binder no one else would ever read. She thought of the mortgage letter lying somewhere among apples and papers and hands. She thought of the hush in the museum at night where things exist without showing off. She thought of a seamstress on a bus that did not know her name. She thought of an orchid returning to soil only in theory. A sentence formed in her without words and asked for a life that did not require proof. The sentence frightened her by being true. Judgment made no proclamation. It left her with a temperature change she could not explain. It placed, gently, a distance between the woman she was when the card sang and the woman she was now, when the song had stopped echoing and only air remained. It did not condemn her purchases. It measured their power and discovered, without malice, their limit. When night fully arrived, she turned from the edge and resumed the life she had engineered. The cameras would come again. The headlines would deliver their punishment. The gala would name her correctly. The rooftop would accept new parties. The dress would teach a room to hush. The car would hum like a solved equation. The art would speak her surname in a museum voice. And yet, beneath the machinery of arrangement, a second mechanism had begun to operate, quiet, stubborn, interior. It would not ask for receipts. It would ask for rooms without audiences. It would ask whether giving that cannot be photographed counts more than giving that can. It would ask whether love prefers theaters or kitchens. It would ask how a person becomes generous when no one keeps score. It would ask, daily and without mercy, whether excellence needs applause or whether it can bear being merely good. Elara did not have answers. She had calendars and competence and a binder that could convince almost anyone that sincerity had been purchased and delivered on time. She set the binder in a drawer and closed the drawer as if burying a season. She stood at the window and watched the city practice survival. She let her hand rest against the glass until the glass cooled her palm. She allowed the kitchen to return one more time. Not obedient now, not curated, simply present. Steam, clock, field. A woman reading a letter quietly because quiet was the only way to protect a miracle from dissolving. She went to bed early, not as surrender but as rehearsal for waking differently. The card lay on the nightstand like a square of last night's weather. She looked at it until her eyes refused to continue. Sleep arrived not as a rescue but as a proposal to stop counting. She accepted without signing. In the morning, a white dress waited on a mannequin that did not know what bodies mean. Somewhere else, a page turned in a man's study. Somewhere else, a maid with a name simple as water finished one task and began another, carrying a vow that would not appear on any invoice. The city, indifferent and exquisite, opened itself again like a book without an ending. Elara did not know it yet, but her day of proof would later be remembered as a room at the beginning of a hallway she could not avoid walking. The hallway would have fewer lights than she preferred and more doors than she had budgeted for. Behind one door, a woman's purchase would dismantle a philosophy built carefully from glass. Behind another, a man would discover that precision cannot repair a heart that answers to mercy. Behind a third, silence would say a true thing and leave it there unframed. For now the rooftop rested, the binder slept, the orchids rehearsed their brief immortality. For now judgment hovered unmoving, the way a star appears to stay still even as the earth beneath it spins. For now, Elara remained inside the version of herself that could be posted and applauded. In the quiet beneath the applause, another version assembled in darkness, patient and articulate, preparing to ask a kinder question. Vanessa kept her life in columns. One for what was owed. One for what could be delayed without breaking. One for what would never be purchased because wanting it was cheaper than having it. Her childhood had trained her to believe that discipline is a form of tenderness. Her 20s taught her that tenderness without leverage disappears. Now at 32, she walked the world with a ledger and an ethic that sounded like a metronome. The card arrived on a weekday pretending to be tame. It lay on her desk between a stack of vendor contracts and a tray of signatures Alexander preferred to deliver at the end of afternoons when numbers behave. The card's surface held her reflection and reduced her face to weather. She did not touch it first. She finished answering an email that required small tactical lies, and then closed her laptop as if sealing a room with better air behind the screen. Vanessa did not believe in tests. She believed in systems. Yet the word test threaded itself through the day's errands. She revised the week's schedule until each appointment clicked into alignment, then dragged a line of color across the calendar to mark the hours the card would be in her custody. The color looked like permission and like danger. She breathed as if oxygen were a budget. This was not the first time the universe had slid temptation toward her in sleek packaging. She had learned to treat temptation like a client. Listen, nod, send it away with a promise to follow up. But the rules had been recalibrated by the sentence he had delivered. Spend however you wish. No limits. No supervision. Honesty, not justification. She admired the elegance of those terms. They made her feel visible and dangerous, which is to say alive. Her first purchase was not money leaving. It was money refusing to leave. She logged into the fortress where numbers sleep and increased the security on the card to absurdity, then revoked the absurdity because the absurdity would attract questions. She installed alerts that would sing to her phone if the card sneezed. She kept the phone on her desk. Like a siren that had agreed to whisper. Then, without fanfare, she went to work on a project that had been courting her attention for months without receiving it. The cost of everyone's fatigue. The company bled time in tiny, undramatic ways. Software licenses that forced double entry. Service contracts that had outlived their usefulness but survived through habit. Logistics that marched like a parade when a quiet walk would do. She used the card to purchase time disguised as infrastructure. She upgraded systems the board would never thank, prepaid services that would stabilize the invisible, bought tools that would nibble at chaos until chaos decided to marry order. The card sang softly, the kind of music that introduces a scene no one will remember, and yet without which the plot cannot proceed. From infrastructure she moved to gravity, the kind that keeps people from flying apart. She made a list of names that never appear in press releases. A night security guard with a knee that had learned the weather better than any meteorologist. A receptionist whose mother's medication had begun to make arithmetic impossible. A junior analyst whose father had left quietly when the boy was young and left behind a habit of pretending to be fine. She used the card to pay hospital bills that stripped dignity by itemizing it, to fund a month of relief where relief makes work possible, to replace a rent deposit swallowed by a mistaken eviction notice. No signatures from those helped were required. Anonymity is the elegance of real assistance. The card sang again, lower now, as if it had learned reverence. Vanessa purchased something unfashionable, certainty. She prepaid the cleaning staff's wages for a quarter so that vacations could be taken without choosing between rest and rent. She bought ergonomic chairs for the assistant's bullpen, the kind that forgives years of loyalty better than flowers. She arranged childcare stipends for 2 employees who had perfected the art of sprinting toward daycare 5 minutes before closing, and she installed a small, dignified room where a mother could pump without turning the supply closet into a chapel. No plaque identified her. The only evidence was the absence of a certain kind of panic. Ambition, which had never been her enemy, knocked politely. It asked whether power could be purchased without becoming a thief. She considered the question and chose an answer that tasted like steel. She acquired a certification program, expensive, rigorous, respected, that she would complete quietly at night so that the competence she wore would have a deeper lining. She bought the exam for a team member who did not yet know her own height. She registered 2 more for a workshop that would teach them to argue with authority without sounding like conflict. She booked a conference for herself, and then canceled the fancy hotel associated with it, and booked a cheaper one 2 blocks away. She did not inform anyone. She made power work for her instead of being seen working for power. Vanessa also purchased exits. She rented a small office across town under a company name that did not yet exist but would, if necessary. Inside that rented room, she placed nothing but a table and a whiteboard and a single chair, because she trusted austerity to tell the truth. This was not betrayal. This was oxygen stored in case the building caught fire. She bought a domain that resembled an idea and parked a homepage there with a single sentence. We practice excellence as if the world depended on it. She did not post it. She merely liked the way the sentence held hands with the dark. At midday she ate at her desk because rituals insist on themselves. She cut an apple into clean crescents and answered a text from a friend whose life existed in a different currency, chaos disguised as adventure. The text asked if she was happy. She placed the phone face down and returned to the work of making other people's futures coherent. She considered happiness the way a physicist considers wind, observable, measurable, interesting, and not a thing you own. Afternoon began to melt into evening when she remembered the place where she had learned to be precise. Her mother, who pronounced sacrifice as if the word were the name of a person she trusted, had taught Vanessa that a good life is a ledger filled with checks in the right columns. They had survived a decade by refusing to be dramatic. A hospital account still sent letters like mild threats. Vanessa used the card to erase those letters. The erasure did not make a sound in the world. Her mother would call later and talk about the weather for 20 minutes before mentioning that a miracle had happened in the mail, and even then she would insist on paying her daughter back, with interest, in some currency that cannot be minted. Vanessa did not weep in the office. She permitted a long breath and then purchased something delightful, a piano lesson package for a child whose hands had been tapping brilliance on a cafeteria table for months with nothing to show for it but rhythm. The boy's mother would find an envelope with a note that did not say her daughter's name and a schedule that did. Language failed to be adequate and therefore remained absent. The card sang and stopped quickly, as if embarrassed by its own sweetness. Next, she went hunting for waste disguised as prestige. The executive floor had acquired, over the years, a taste for very good coffee produced by a very bad contract. She ended that contract and signed a new one that would save enough over a year to fund scholarships for 2 interns, including travel, if they were first-generation college students and brave. She renegotiated a cloud service that billed as if clouds were made of gold. She fired a consultancy that delivered slides like sermons and hired 3 part-time analysts with brains that do not need sermon notes to think. The card sang in staccato. Small, precise notes, the music of competence. Then came an extravagance only Vanessa would recognize as such. She bought silence. Not the expensive silence of a private island, but the kind that allows a mind to practice its highest instrument uninterrupted. She rented a weekend retreat near water where office phones cannot find you, and she placed there a stack of books nobody asks about in interviews. She wrote on the booking, "No photography, no posting, no publicity. Let the mind be different. **** She would go alone. She would take a pen. She would become more dangerous through gentleness. Vanessa did something else that accountants can understand and romantics often fail to see. She purchased redundancy. She duplicated key processes in a way that, if catastrophe arrived, the machine would limp but not die. She ordered backups of data and backups of the backups and installed protocols that make disasters boring. Prevention is unphotographable greatness. She liked the thought and let it stay. As evening lowered itself over the city like a curtain trained to fall on cue, Vanessa turned towards something personal that she had postponed for years. Her teeth. They had obeyed youth and poverty and time obediently. They had not always obeyed confidence. She scheduled a procedure she had convinced herself she did not need and paid for it, not to be more beautiful, but to remove a small, daily humiliation. The appointment would settle an old argument between her body and her future. The card sang a note that sounded like apology and acceptance at once. She moved then into a neighborhood rarely visited by majesty, the neighborhood of grief that never announces itself. She bought a headstone for a friend who had been buried under a wooden cross that could not resist weather. She paid the cemetery to clean the stones around it, not for symmetry but for fairness. She did this without telling the friend's mother, who would have insisted on contributing from a wallet that could not afford the dignity she deserved. She scheduled the stone to be placed on a day she could be there alone. Some purchases require witnesses, others ask the sky to keep records. Vanessa returned to the office and opened a spreadsheet that divided her heart into the kind of logic the world respects. She itemized the day in a document no one would read. It told a story that could appear dull to a certain appetite. Systems strengthened, people stabilized, egos denied their treats, scholarships funded, chairs that would prevent future surgeries, software that would save thousands of hours across a year's calendar. She created a second tab labeled extravagances and listed her mother's relief, the piano lessons, her own dental courage, the headstone, the retreat by the water. She gave that tab a color that reminded her of rain. Night arrived with its practiced intimacy, and the city polished its lights. Vanessa took the card for a walk without stores. She went to the library near her apartment and renewed her card there, because she had a superstition that power without pages becomes stupid. She donated a generous sum to the library's quiet budget, so that a child could sit in a chair and meet a book that will ruin and repair them in the same afternoon. No plaque. She asked only for new lamps with bulbs that make words comfortable. The librarian blessed her without knowing why. She slept briefly and well, then woke when the world was still deciding whether to be morning. In the gray hour when ambition hums at a frequency only certain hearts can hear, she reviewed the alerts on her phone and smiled at their obedience. No fraud. No chaos. Only the music of things functioning. She opened her calendar and saw how the day would stand if she were not careful. She bent it to her will. She made time for 2 conversations, one with a young colleague who terrified herself with excellence, one with a vendor who had been treated too long like furniture. She bought them both lunch with a card that did not need to know its food was becoming confession. On her way to the office she visited a church she did not believe in because the architecture believed in something. She sat in a pew and let stillness speak a language she usually edits out. She did not pray. She did not apologize. She permitted gratitude to exist without asking it to perform. When she left, she dropped an envelope into a metal box and asked the envelope to find a person who needed a sudden absence of worry. The card sang inaudibly. Vanessa delivered her receipts in an envelope without theater. She placed it on Alexander's desk that had learned from the years how to deliver consequences without adding commentary. Inside were headlines that would never be printed: utility before spectacle, dignity before decoration, logistics before legend. The sums did not shout. They spoke with the voice of a well-run engine. The numbers were enormous in the aggregate and modest compared to the empire's appetite. She had spent generously on the invisible and selfishly on what would make her more precise. She had purchased a small island of sovereignty and several bridges to other people's mornings. Judgment wandered the room like a draft that finds the smallest gaps and makes itself known. It did not accuse Vanessa. It admired her mathematics. It conceded that ambition has a right to groom itself. It noticed that she had invested in a future where power does not have to ask permission to be kind. It also noticed a glint that had accompanied every click, the quiet, hard shine of a woman securing her altitude because altitude is the only place she can breathe cleanly. Discovery did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived with a line on a receipt she had written at dawn and forgotten by 10. She had purchased 3 winter coats for 3 children who belonged to no one she knew, through a program that disrespects cold. The coats would travel in a box with other boxes to a warehouse that would hold them until weather allowed need to present itself. She found the line item and stared at the amount as if a number could confess. She tried to remember why she had done it and discovered no strategy attached. This startled her more than the larger line items. She had bought something without a plan. It had felt like breathing. She let the astonishment visit and then sit quietly on the corner of her desk. In the late afternoon she walked the floor of the office with an attention so respectful it did not resemble surveillance. People worked in their rectangles, lit by screens that demanded loyalty. She saw a woman whose eyes blinked too slowly. She sent her home and logged 2 hours of paid time into a system that would never connect the mercy with the ledger. She saw a man whose hands hovered above keys as if afraid to be seen making mistakes. She sat in his chair and showed him how she makes mistakes with speed, then deletes them with laughter, and then moves on, and he smiled in a way that suggested a life had been slightly altered. These things did not cost money. They cost the currency she most guarded, the belief that her usefulness depended on being elsewhere. In the evening, Vanessa did a thing she had planned for years and never permitted. She went to a small music hall and sat in the cheap seats and listened to a quartet perform a piece that feels like glass remembering sand. She had bought her own ticket with her own card, and she kept the company's card inside her wallet as a sleeping animal. She listened without taking notes. She let the music enter her like instruction. Sustain, release, sustain, hush. She realized that the most luxurious thing she had purchased that day was not the retreat, not the headstone, not the redundancy, though all those were excellent. It was the ability to sit still without the world falling apart because she had built a machine that does not require her panic to run. The night after the music was quiet in a way the wealthy sometimes call loneliness and the disciplined call rest. She walked home through streets that had learned her footfalls, stopped at a bakery that hates debit because cash tells a better joke, and bought a loaf the color of patience. She thought about the card and its spent hours and felt no guilt, no pride, only an accurate fatigue. She slept because the day wanted her to, not because she surrendered. Morning returned the card to him. Her fingers released it the way a diver releases the ladder after learning to trust water. She did not report. She did not present a binder. She believed in results that deliver themselves. He would see a calendar that no longer tripped, a team that stood differently, an engine whose hum had acquired a new confidence. He would hear fewer complaints and imagine the world had improved of its own accord. He might ask what she had done. She would answer with an invoice summary and a sentence about upgrades. If he pressed, she would give him 2 paragraphs of clarity. She would not mention the headstone or the coats or the music or the room with a table where independence waits like a well-behaved escape. Discovery continued through the day without asking for attention. A developer found a new tool in her email and used it, and the task that used to take 6 hours took 2. And she went home early and surprised her child in the most ordinary way, which is to say in the way that saves childhood. A cleaner took her first weekend away in 5 years, and returned with her back undecided about its pain. A librarian ordered lamps. A mother cried in a kitchen not because of sorrow but because a financial sentence had ended with a period and not a comma. The engine warmed its voice and sang. Vanessa, at her desk, answered 3 emails that would prevent 4 meetings and then took 10 minutes to stare at a photograph of the sea she had never visited in daylight. In a museum where a label had been approved the day before, a docent practiced the pronunciation of a surname that was not Vanessa's. She listened to the docent and decided she did not want that kind of echo. She wanted a different kind, untraceable, reliable, wide. She wanted to be the reason a machine ran without knowing who to credit. She wanted to build a life so competent that dignity happened to other people as a side effect. Evening brought with it the soft, unspectacular conclusion of a long intention. She sat at her small kitchen table with the bread she had bought and a bowl of soup that believed in understatement. She opened her personal computer and clicked on the domain she had purchased under a name that feels like a promise and a dare. She changed the sentence on the homepage. It now read, "We practice excellence as if someone gentle is depending on it." She did not publish. She merely looked at the sentence until she felt her pulse agree. She closed the laptop and turned off the light, and let the sentence glow in the dark like a lighthouse no one can see until they need it. The card had measured her and found itself changed. It had learned to pay for things that dividends cannot describe. It had discovered that ambition can feed others without pretending to starve. It had seen a woman stacking invisible bricks into a house where storms dislike arriving. The test, if it existed, had been unfortunate, too simple for the complexity of a well-made soul. Yet within the crude frame of test and pass and fail, Vanessa had written an essay that would refuse grading. She had bought what the company never budgets for, a version of tomorrow less cruel than yesterday. No orchestra accompanied her day. No camera rehearsed candor. No rooftop revised its angle to flatter her. But if you listened that night in the turbines of the building or in the size of the office chairs when no one sat on them or in the way a server hummed with nothing crashing, you could hear a music composed of ordinary mercies. And in the morning, if you stepped onto a bus at a stop 2 neighborhoods away, you might see a boy tapping a rhythm on his knees that had learned new notes. He would not know a card and a woman and a ledger had made room for that melody. He would simply play, and the day would be better for it, and no headline would intervene. Vanessa woke before the city's argument with itself began and stood by her window wearing a robe she had purchased 10 years ago that had outlived 3 apartments and a version of herself she had resigned from. She looked at the street, which was busy with the self-respect of early labor, and thought about wealth the way some people think about weather. Everyone talks about it. Few remember it touches the ground. She poured coffee into a mug with a crack that refused to break and held it like a steadying thought. She believed in precision. She also believed, now more than yesterday, in mercy as a system. When she arrived at the office, a vase of flowers did not wait on her desk and a ribbon did not stretch across her chair. A calendar waited. She liked calendars. She opened her laptop. She began again. Somewhere, on a kitchen table bent slightly in the middle from years of carrying meals, a mother placed a bill beside a letter that said it had become a receipt for 0. Somewhere, on a small stage a week from now, a child would play a song not even the composer expected, and an old woman would close her eyes and forgive a decade. Somewhere, under stone, A name that had been loved received the dignity that weather had denied it. Somewhere, water waited for her to arrive and do nothing heroic. And somewhere else, in a penthouse where glass had taught the sky to behave, a man would open his safe and discover that wealth can be accounted for without being understood. He would look for proof in binders and find it dull. He would search for spectacle and find it absent. He would learn later that a test meant for others had turned its face toward him and begun to ask why he had believed a heart could be measured in the price of applause. For now Vanessa kept her columns. For now the engine ran. For now the music stayed quiet and exact and generous. The card slept in a drawer waiting for its next performance. And the city, unaware of what had been purchased for it, went about its business with slightly less cruelty than before. No trumpet, no headline, just a subtle subtraction of hurt where a ledger had chosen to be kind. The day after competence, the city woke up easier. Elevators remembered to arrive without dramatics. A thermostat somewhere in the server room stopped flirting with catastrophe. A cleaner stretched her spine and discovered the new chair had learned her body without being asked. An analyst pressed save and watched a process that once took hours complete in a handful of civilized minutes. These improvements were not beautiful in the way gowns are beautiful. They were faithful in the way good weather is faithful, unnoticed until it isn't. Vanessa moved through the office like air that knows the building's bones. Her shoes counted quietly. The calendar obeyed its new geometry. Yesterday's purchases, silent, unphotographable, had already begun to rearrange the texture of other people's mornings. Competence had always been her native element. Now it was the city's. Discovery, which had been hovering since the coats and the headstone and the retreat by water, took a chair beside her and stayed. It arrived in the way she looked at a spreadsheet and saw not cells but lives. It arrived when she caught herself saving a document with a name that included the word mercy, then renaming it to something software could respect. It arrived when she realized that she had erased fear from a dozen corners of a map, and that those corners now responded by making room for gentleness. Gentleness is the partner of precision when neither tries to be the other. A week condensed into a single day of good behavior. Vendors stopped arguing with contracts because the contracts had learned to be fair. A courier laughed in a lobby because the tip he found in an envelope suggested the world occasionally keeps promises. The library installed lamps. A child sat beneath their new light and forgot to be small. The headstone waited in a workshop where stone remembers names better than people do. The coats crossed state lines by truck and solved nothing and changed everything for three bodies Winter had been planning to sentence. Vanessa kept her receipts, not because anyone demanded them, but because history prefers paper. She stacked them into categories that resembled a creed: systems, dignity, exits, repair, learning, breath. She added a seventh category with one entry only, then stared at its emptiness until the emptiness confessed it wanted to be called future. She did not fill it. She respected its appetite. On a Tuesday disguised as a Friday, Vanessa stood in the small room she had rented across town. The room with one table, one chair, one whiteboard, nothing else. The window was undecided about light. Dust auditioned for gravity in a stripe across the table's edge. She removed the cap from a marker and wrote a sentence at the top of the board, built so well that absence isn't a crisis. Below it, she wrote 5 smaller sentences that sounded like laws and felt like kindness. Do not worship speed. Protect the quiet workers. Keep an exit the way sailors keep a rope. Treat surplus as a tool, not as a theater. Spend where fear lives. She left the room without erasing her sentences. She locked the door and returned the key to her pocket. The door didn't know it was protecting a possibility. Discovery followed her into the evening. She sat on a bench and watched a construction crane rehearse a future for a building that would one day pretend to be eternal. A boy on a bicycle took a corner too bravely, and then learned lesson and balance in the same second. A couple argued softly with their bodies, the way tired love rehearses grammar it no longer needs. Vanessa felt a generosity rise in her that didn't need the card to translate itself. She looked at her hands and understood that she had been building a life in which her usefulness was only one kind of wealth. The retreat by water arrived on the calendar and refused cancellation. She packed a small bag that treated vanity with respect but not reverence and took a train that taught the city to become a field, and then a river and then a long thought. Silence waited in a white room with windows that did not ask for blinds. She placed her notebook on the table as if surrender could be neat. Outside, water practiced the old sentences. Come here, go on, begin again. The first hour by the water was the hardest. Every nerve returned to its factory settings and hissed about emails that were not being sent. Then quiet put its hands on her shoulders and taught her posture. She wrote lists at first because lists are bridges between noise and stillness. Then she wrote a map of the work she had done with the card, lines connecting people who would never meet, arrows that turned debt into daylight, notes about redundancy and the true cost of panic. She wrote the word worth and, beneath it, not a number but 4 names, none of them her own. At dusk, she walked to the shore where stones told the story of weight and patience. She did not take her phone. She watched a gull argue with the wind and lose and then win and then forget the argument. The water translated the horizon into breathing. Vanessa felt a regret she could respect. It was not shame for ambition. Ambition had paid for chairs and lamps and coats. It was a regret for all the years she had believed love must be earned with spotless execution. She sat with the regret until it turned into a decision. Keep the spine made of ledgers, yes, but build a second spine made of mercy. Morning appointed the light and kept its appointment. Vanessa returned to the city with a different silence inside her, one she could carry into rooms without adjusting the furniture. She opened the office early and stood where no cameras would ever stand, behind the reception desk for 5 minutes, watching the building wake. A guard limped a little less. The new coffee machine respected time. A cleaner placed a vase in the exact center of a table and smiled not at the vase but at the symmetry. Vanessa felt the usefulness of invisibility and experienced, briefly, the temptation to remain invisible forever. Then she remembered that leadership is a kind of visibility you loan to other people, not a light you hoard. In the middle of the morning, discovery became specific. Vanessa saw Maria. She had seen her for years, of course, glimpses at thresholds, a shadow the color of discipline, a uniform the color of duty. But today, after water and sentences and the realization that worth is measured in names, Vanessa saw the way Maria moved. How she carried a tray like a promise and set it down like a blessing. How she paused at a window as if windows sometimes require consoling. How she kept a small square of cloth in her apron pocket and took it out not to wipe surface but to remove sorrow from corners no one else noticed. Maria crossed the marble quietly with an object in her hands that did not match the penthouse vocabulary. A simple plastic lunchbox, dented at one corner, wrapped in an elastic band that had learned loyalty. She placed the lunchbox in the staff refrigerator without writing a name on it. The refrigerator did not need the name. The staff knew the lunchbox belonged to the person who never took more than she needed. Vanessa watched from a distance that respected dignity. She saw the bruise on Maria's knuckle, old enough to be healing and honest enough not to pretend. She saw the way Maria folded the cloth in her pocket after use as if the cloth had feelings. She saw a slip of paper with numbers in a column, a list written in a hand that preferred order but could not afford delay. She did not read the numbers. She recognized the handwriting because she shared the handwriting's nature. Make do, make clean, make right. The card's second day in Vanessa's possession arrived without fanfare. The banker had arranged a 2-day window for each woman so that impulse could not claim victory over intention. Vanessa had already spent the first day on engines and exits. She spent the second like a person who had been taught by water. She purchased mornings for people who had never owned one. She called the Transit Authority's Anonymous Fund and filled it until 100 small days would not collapse on the sidewalk for lack of fare. She prepaid lunches at the diner where the line cooks knew the names of men who pretended not to need knowing. She bought a week of open tabs at a laundromat near the school, because cleaner clothes persuade teachers to see intelligence before mischief. She visited the hospital where arithmetic used to threaten her mother, and placed a quiet donation into an account reserved for emergencies that punish dignity. She did not choose a wing or a plaque. She chose a clerk who had not been thanked in a decade and asked that clerk to make the money go where pride would otherwise prevent relief. The clerk looked up at nothing in particular, and remembered a prayer that had been idle. She walked through a park at noon and recognized the choreography of careful lives, joggers solving private math, nannies translating 2 languages into one nap, a man on a bench wearing a suit that had lost its argument with relevance. She bought shade for that park. Trees that would not be tall for years but would begin immediately to believe they would be. She bought water for soil, not for guests. She purchased a bench without a plaque and a trash can with a lid that respects wind. The card sang in the key of municipal patience. Later, She stood in a small supply store that sells objects nobody celebrates, and bought a cupboard of soap and paper towels and disinfectant for a community center that smelled like effort. She purchased a second set and had it delivered to a shelter whose address she had memorized from a volunteer sheet she kept postponing. She promised herself a Tuesday evening there, not to teach, not to fix, but to wipe tables with the cloth she had bought and listen to how survival pronounces its verbs. When the sun moved from authority to hospitality, Vanessa let herself enter a store where wanting used to be cheaper than having. She tried on a coat that fit like a sentence she had been trying to say correctly for years. She looked at herself in a mirror that had earned the right to tell the truth. She did not buy the coat. She bought the mirror and had it sent to the staff locker room. She wanted the people who held the building together to see themselves with the kind of accuracy that improves posture. Discovery insisted. This was not about restraint for its own sake. This was about taste discovering its allegiance. She bought running shoes for her own feet, and a physical therapy package she had avoided because pain had become a personality trait. She scheduled the therapy between 2 meetings that could survive her absence and told no one. She decided to become slightly softer with herself and exactly as hard with systems. She returned to the office with systems. She returned to the office near dusk and found Maria placing a vase of ordinary daisies on a sill where the view overwhelmed lesser flowers. The daisies argued with the skyline and lost beautifully. Vanessa watched the argument and felt something in her chest give up a habit. The habit surrendered without ceremony. The envelope of receipts she would deliver to Alexander grew thicker, not with spectacle but with the weight of causes that rarely attract cameras. It contained line items that read like kindness disguised as accounting, scholarships disguised as software savings, dental courage disguised as self-respect, a bench disguised as anonymity, trees disguised as future shade, a mirror disguised as a revolution spread across 12 lockers. She added one more purchase before the day concluded, a line that looked like nothing and meant a great deal, a book order for the company's small, neglected reading shelf, manuals of clarity, essays about fairness, a thin volume on how to apologize correctly, a collection of poems about work, a children's picture book about the courage of repair. She instructed the office manager to rotate the books weekly and to never require sign-outs. Trust is cheaper than tracking. The card sang once more and then leveled into quiet. Night folded the building back into itself. Vanessa took the long way home, past the river where the water moved with the confidence of a creature that has never needed applause. She stood on a bridge and understood that some days do not end, they change shape and continue inside other hearts. She allowed the memory of her father's absence to sit beside her without diminishing the bench. She allowed the thought of the headstone to settle into the river and not sink. She allowed the image of Maria with daisies to become the sentence she would carry into sleep. The next morning, she placed the envelope on Alexander's desk, unadorned, unperformed. She did not linger. She trusted results to speak. The envelope contained proof that would look unheroic to certain appetites and necessary to anyone who has ever loved a week into functioning. Numbers that did not ascend like fireworks. Numbers that held like scaffolding. A different discovery occurred in the hour after she returned the card. Without the plastic square in her wallet, she felt lighter in a way that did not resemble loss. She recognized the relief of not being a conduit for someone else's philosophy for a day. She recognized, too, the dangerous sweetness of power that has learned compassion. It can make a person believe she is finished with growth. She wrote a note to herself in the plainest language she owned. Do not confuse competent mercy with completion. At lunch she walked to the museum and stood in front of the piece that would have spoken Elara's surname soon. The gallery was quiet. The air practiced reverence. The art remained indifferent to patrons and perfect for time. She felt no envy and no disdain. Only the accuracy that comes when a person looks at a thing and sees it as itself, without longing to be seen by it. On her way out, she passed a staff door propped open by a rubber wedge that had lost ambition. A woman in a gray jumpsuit lugged a crate and did not set it down because setting it down would require picking it up again. Vanessa stepped aside and let the woman pass and wished, for a brief radical moment, that the museum would offer labels for the labor rather than the pieces. She left without making a speech to anyone. She carried the thought like a coin warmed by a palm. The week ended with a meeting where Alexander praised the company for feeling suddenly lighter, cleaner, faster. He did not attribute the feeling to anyone. Leaders rarely know which thread was tightened by which pair of hands. Vanessa did not mind. Credit is a currency that evaporates when hoarded. She watched him as he watched the room and wondered, for the first time with sincerity and not as an exercise, what the test was teaching him. A night after the meeting, in her apartment that had learned not to apologize for being modest, she took out the domain she had purchased and wrote 3 paragraphs for a website no one would see. She tried to articulate the sentence the river had given her, that excellence without tenderness becomes intimidation, and tenderness without excellence becomes ruin. She typed until the words stopped performing and started working. Then she closed the laptop and went to the sink and washed a single mug and dried it and placed it in the cabinet and felt the ordinary triumph of things returning to their places. Across town, Maria's lunchbox sat in the refrigerator beside a labeled jar of something green and aspirational. Maria would pick up the lunchbox before anyone saw her and eat in a corner that belonged to no one. She would cross numbers off her slip of paper and add others and hum a song that did not ask for witnesses. She would hold in her pocket a card with the same name printed on it that the other women had held. She would spend it in a way that would not flatter opulence or ambition. She would purchase a sentence that money rarely agrees to say. Vanessa did not know the details. She knew only that the city had gone quiet in a way that felt like an inhale before a confession. She closed her eyes and saw the daisies again, and behind them, a village she had never visited and a hospital with a window that would soon open and a boy with a rhythm that no longer needed permission and a headstone that would change weather into blessing and a river teaching a billionaire to listen to something he did not own. When morning came, she dressed in a navy suit that had learned not to be new and walked to work listening for small music. The rumble of a bus forgiving a curb, the soft friction of shoes owned by people who stand all day, the printer behaving as if paper deserved peace. She passed Maria in the hallway and nodded and received a nod in return that contained more dignity than most promotions. The nod felt like an oath between strangers. The envelope on Alexander's desk would lead his eyes through a garden he had not planned to visit. In that garden, numbers would be flowers that attract bees instead of cameras. He would read lines that made no boast and prompt no champagne, and yet would lower the building's heart rate a measurable amount. He would feel respect for a woman who had purchased a future without renting applause. He would not yet understand that the test he imagined had already graded him, and placed the paper face down on his chair. Vanessa returned to her columns. But now each column obeyed a new law, that the sum of a day is measured not only by profit or the absence of error, but by how many fears retired before night and how many quiet workers returned home with one less heaviness to carry up their stairs. Behind the glass that taught the sky to behave, the next card changed hands. It moved toward the woman whose life had never required a binder and who would, before the week ended, spend a fortune without buying anything for herself. She would not call it virtue. She would call it necessary. The city waited with the patience of stone and the curiosity of rain. Somewhere, 3 coats were zipped by 3 pairs of small hands, and air lost interest in cruelty. Somewhere, a librarian switched on a lamp and watched a child lean into a book as if warmth were printed on the page. Somewhere, a cemetery worker wiped stone as if names can feel welcome. Somewhere, trees began the long work of becoming shade for people who have carried heat like a second job. And somewhere, a billionaire stared at the night and finally suspected that money might be excellent at everything except the one thing it had been trying to do for him: teach him how to love without keeping score. Morning stepped into the city without asking permission, and the city, already awake, pretended to be surprised. In offices made of glass and language, schedules negotiated with urgency, emails rehearsed their importance, and elevators decided, as they always do, who would be lifted first. Somewhere a kettle insisted on its soft argument for patience. Somewhere a siren practiced being the last voice in a conversation. Somewhere a wristwatch told the truth about how quickly courage evaporates when no one is watching. Vanessa read the day the way a conductor reads an orchestra at rest, seeing not silence but readiness. She had returned the card, but the echo of its power kept working, not as volume but as calibration. Mechanical things behaved. Human things breathed. She felt something unusual in her chest, a surplus of steadiness. It did not produce pride. It produced responsibility. She printed a single page titled Aftercare and placed it where only she would see it. It contained no names, only the stubborn verbs that keep a mercy from fading: confirm, follow, replenish, repair, recheck, remind, return. She had learned long ago that generosity without aftercare is performance. Aftercare is what generosity does when it means it. She began with the coats because winter is efficient. The tracking numbers confessed their routes, each waypoint a little lit window on a map. She wrote a reminder a month ahead to check whether the warehouse had distributed them without ceremony. She added a request that any returns be rerouted to a number she owned rather than to a bin named loss. She liked stealing from loss. She emailed the librarian not to ask for gratitude, but to ask what else the room required to make attention pleasant. The reply came hours later with an apology for asking, and a list that included pencils that don't break and a stapler that doesn't jam and a rug that does what rugs are supposed to do: invite a body to stay. She ordered them all and added a second rug for a corner a child might claim as their kingdom without a permit. She smiled at the thought of a kingdom made of a lamp and quiet. She called the clinic account she had empowered and asked if any harm had knocked unexpectedly. The clerk cleared her throat to keep dignity in place and mentioned a father who needed a prescription refilled before Friday to avoid a spiral. Vanessa said yes to Friday before the clerk finished the sentence. She wondered how many spirals in a year begin because no one could say yes before Friday. On the executive floor, a conversation drifted out of a glass room like perfume that gets the elevator before you do. It was bright and bland and full of the kind of certainty budgets commit when they have never carried groceries up 4 flights of stairs. She passed the room, not as a refusal but as an edit. She had work to do where decisions become weather. A vendor arrived with a stack of forms that believed in themselves. Vanessa reduced the stack to 4 pages with a red pen and a tone of voice that taught arrogance to bow. She received in return a respect that had nothing to do with charm. Then she walked the floor and noticed 3 screws missing from a hinge on a fire door, and sent a ticket that would prevent a catastrophe that would never make the news. Prevention remains unphotographable greatness. At noon she allowed herself a ritual she had postponed during the days of emergency: a walk without headphones. The city insisted on narrating itself without help. A woman in a yellow raincoat, though there was no rain, carried a cake like a secret. A street preacher argued with weather and looked like he was winning. A construction worker sat on a curb and texted with a grin that forgave his shoes their exhaustion. Vanessa realized that competence had a cousin called celebration, and that she had ignored the cousin for years because celebration rarely fills spreadsheets. She turned a corner and crossed into a street where the buildings remembered when ambition wore brick. An antique store displayed things that had already survived other people's certainty: a chair with honest scars, a mirror that had learned humility, a clock that refused to mimic urgency. She stepped inside and felt time sit down. On a back shelf, a modest wooden frame leaned against a stack of frames that had given up asking to be chosen. The glass was gone. The wood had been sanded so often it had become a suggestion rather than a border. She bought the frame without knowing what it would hold. She carried it like a question that did not threaten. When she returned, Vanessa found on her desk a small envelope addressed in a careful hand that respected ink. Inside a note: asterisk, thank you for the lamps. We didn't know light could be kind. Asterisk, no signature. No logo. Just the honesty of someone who had seen a room change shape and decided to name it. She placed the note under the wooden frame without glass and realized the frame had wanted to hold a sentence all along. Afternoon delivered a meeting that did not understand what meetings are for. Slides like frost dulled the room. Numbers stacked into pyramids that would never shelter anyone. Vanessa listened with professionalism and the loyalty she reserves for the truth. When it was her turn, she gave the room nothing pretty and everything useful. She described the new system that turned 6 hours into 2. She described the redundancy that made panic inefficient. She described the chairs that prevented a future surgery. She did not mention the headstone. She did not mention the coats. She did not mention the mirror in the locker room that taught a body to respect itself. She let the room believe that competence had arrived from nowhere, the way rain convinces the ground it invented water. The meeting ended not with applause but with work, which is the preferred conclusion of a good meeting. In the hall, a young analyst stopped her and asked a question without realizing it was a confession. How do you make everyone calmer without telling them to calm down? Vanessa answered the only way that would not embarrass truth: remove the causes. The analyst wrote nothing down and would remember everything. Near evening, a text from an unknown number arrived. The mortgage letter came. I don't know who you are. I put the letter on the table and my hands on it. For 10 minutes I forgot how to move. Then I made tea. That's all. Vanessa did not reply. She saved the number under nobody/somebody and placed the phone face down the way a person covers a candle with a glass to keep the flame from hurting itself. She left the office late, not as a badge, but as an ordinary consequence of care. She stopped at the small bakery that keeps the street from believing in hunger, and asked for bread with a crust that reminds a person to be awake when they chew. The baker wrapped it in paper the color of forgiveness. On the way home she passed the museum. Through its lit windows she saw a janitor move a mop in a pattern so precise it resembled prayer. She thought again about labels for labor and felt the kind of loyalty that makes a person dangerous. Night settled properly. In her apartment she placed the wooden frame with the note on a shelf and beside it the smallest object she owned with the largest story, a concert ticket torn by a hand that had frightened her with kindness once. She poured water into a glass and listened to it sound like a small river. She sat at the table and wrote a letter to her mother she would not send, telling her about chairs and lamps and the way a coat late in a season can be the difference between ambition and survival. She folded the letter and put it in a drawer labeled evidence. Sometime after midnight, while the city negotiated a truce with itself, Vanessa woke to a thought that did not knock. She had spent a great deal to make others' lives easier and had spent nothing to make it easier for them to be seen. She rose, sat at the table again, and sketched what she called the wall of unseen work, a hallway wall in the company where no names appear, only verbs and the anonymous initials of jobs. Locked the building at 2:13 a.m. after a false alarm. G. Caught a leak before the archive knew the word flood. R. Stayed late to make a report quiet. L. Carried the daisies to the window and chose the sill that forgives heat. M. She would ask permission from no one and forgiveness from everyone later. She slept again, and the idea slept beside her with its shoes on. The next day she found a blank wall near the service elevator, the elevator that tells the truth about weight. She asked maintenance for a corkboard the size of a stubborn belief and paid for it with her own card because some things must belong to no account. She pinned the first 4 cards on it, white index cards with ink that refused to shout. People would pass. People would pause. People would wonder whether the company had remembered them on purpose. It had, at last, on purpose. Midweek, she checked the retreat booking to ensure that silence had been saved for later. The calendar nodded in the language calendar's use. She verified the stipend deposits for childcare. 2 parents had already written to HR to ask if there was a mistake and if they had to give it back. She asked HR to train its sentences to say, "This is what it looks like when a place believes you should be able to breathe." She added a line to HR's script, "No, you don't have to prove that you deserve it." She visited the staff locker room to move the new mirror 2 inches to the left because a conduit refused to behave. The mirror, obedient and mild, took its new place. As she stepped back, she saw Maria step forward and look at herself not tentatively, not approvingly, but accurately. That is the best a mirror can do. Maria adjusted a strand of hair with the seriousness of a contract. She smiled with one side of her mouth, a smile that said nothing performative had happened, only an alignment. She left. The room kept her absence like a vow. Vanessa felt her own reflection correct its posture as if the mirror had jurisdiction beyond the wall. She thought about the wooden frame without glass and the note it held and realized the frame already had company. The corkboard with 4 sentences, the mirror with posture, the lamp with gentleness, the chair with forgiveness. A pattern was building itself out of furniture and ink and quiet. That afternoon, a courier delivered a small box to Vanessa's desk, light as a wanted letter. Inside, a pressed daisy between 2 sheets of wax paper and a note in a hand that tried not to be learned. "Thank you for choosing the sill that forgives heat." No signature. Vanessa placed the daisy beside the wooden frame, and did not try to preserve it beyond what it had already done to preserve itself. Toward evening, Alexander requested a report he did not know how to ask for. He wanted to see numbers and feel something. He wanted a binder that taught him a lesson without making him admit he needed one. Vanessa prepared a 2-page brief that told the truth sideways. System upgrades. 38% reduction in redundant steps / 27% fewer incident tickets / projected savings equal to 2 scholarships per quarter, Human dignity interventions, measurable decrease in unplanned absences/retention uptick among roles the company forgets to protect. Future-proofing, redundancy and disaster rehearsal, civic threads, library, park, clinic, school, indirect but structural benefits to the city that gives us permission to do business. She included no dollar signs beyond what the accounting software demanded. She included a line at the bottom, note, prevented the kind of fires no insurance covers. She sent it. He replied with a period and the word excellent. She did not need more. After hours, when the building preferred humility, Vanessa took the service elevator down and exited through a door that leads to the alley where trash confesses. Maria stood there in the blue of evening with a bag of recyclables and a gaze that looked at everything as if it might become necessary. Vanessa did not interrupt. She watched the choreography. Sort, rinse, set aside. Pause, consider. Adjust movements shaped by a lifetime of making dignity survive environments not designed for it. On impulse that didn't feel impulsive, Vanessa ordered cases of heavy-duty bins with wheels and lids, the kind that tell rats they are not invited. She scheduled a delivery before dawn with a note to the foreman. These belong to whoever touches them most. Don't move them to look neat. Let them look useful. She added 2 pairs of gloves that make hands believe they are worth protecting and a stack of towels that do not shed. It cost very little. It added a line item to a ledger the world never balances. At home she thought of exits again, the small room with the single chair, and felt no need to visit. Not yet. The room was not for running, it was for knowing she could run. She took out the domain she had purchased and replaced the lighthouse sentence with a better one. We make the machine kind without making it soft. She closed the laptop, declined the question of whether to save, and trusted the machine to remember what mattered. The week turned over. In that turn, proof of purchase scattered across the city like seeds that prefer cracks to gardens. A kid in a puffy coat that didn't belong to a photograph laughed so loud a bus driver forgave a late fare. A nurse in a clinic didn't have to say I'm sorry before saying yes, and the word yes made a father cry careful tears he cleaned with his sleeve so his son wouldn't learn the wrong lesson about crying. A library lamp outlived a storm and made a page obvious. A bench without a plaque held someone who needed to feel held without being named. A tree decided to live. A mirror taught 6 spines to rise without permission. A corkboard became rumor, then tradition. Vanessa walked under these unseen headlines with the lightness that follows heavy work done rightly. She carried still, the stiffness that belongs to a woman who knows she must always be ready to justify a thing the world should have understood at first glance. But the stiffness had softened into readiness rather than defense. She could fight if she had to. She preferred to build until fighting looked inefficient. On a Sunday that remembered to be quiet, she visited the cemetery. The stone had arrived, dignity carved into it like a promise that does not ask for a body's permission to keep being kept. She brushed a leaf away with a tenderness that had learned not to advertise itself. She spoke aloud the name as if names are bridges between absence and presence. She left a single daisy unpressed, unspectacular, its small white insisting calmly beside granite. Wind practiced discretion. When she returned to the street, she saw a woman on a bus reading under a lamplight the color of future. The woman looked like every version of a person who has kept a room warm with small money. She looked like Vanessa's mother and like Vanessa and like someone else entirely. Vanessa smiled without aiming it at anyone. The bus moved on, carrying its moving domesticity. She felt the city as a system again, not the sterile system of permits and budgets, but the pulsing system of days redeemed by acts that do not brag. Back at the penthouse, in glass that reflects a man into multiples he cannot consolidate, Alexander stood with his father's sentence in his hand and his certainty becoming theory. Proof, it turns out, is an unfaithful God. It worships whoever arrives last with the sharpest light. He had seen extravagance sing and competence hum. He had not yet seen what mercy spends when it intends to be irreversible. Vanessa prepared the ground for that sight without knowing. She made a note in her aftercare page. When the maid returns the card, be where outcomes can be caught, not where credit can be claimed. She did not know why she wrote maid instead of Maria. Perhaps because the world had named the role and refused the person. She resolved to learn the person. On Monday, she arrived early and found the building practicing attention. She pinned 2 more cards to the corkboard, restocked the mother's room without being asked, stayed with the server after midnight so it could upgrade without lonely errorty. Someone had placed a third card of their own. Noticed the corkboard needed more pins? Vanessa laughed privately and placed a small bowl of pins on the ledge beneath it. Culture is a bowl of pins that appears before anyone has to ask. The hours expanded politely to make room for what was approaching. A city cannot know it is about to witness an act that will rearrange the gravity in a man's chest. It can only continue being a city. Trains ran. Cafes manufactured beginnings. Rooflines practice being dramatic for sunsets that have not arrived. And in a room where money sleeps in a wallet made of quiet leather, a card lay waiting for a hand that has learned to take nothing extra. Maria, somewhere below the rhetoric of glass, folded a cloth into a square so precise that geometry felt seen. She checked her lunchbox. She checked a list that did not need to be written because it had been breathing in her for days. She touched an envelope she had addressed to no one and to the only person who could receive it. She thought of a door that will open if you stand before it long enough with nothing in your hands but need and a history of choosing less. Vanessa felt the city's pressure drop the way certain birds feel storms before the first leaf moves. She closed the aftercare page and placed it under the wooden frame in the daisy and decided that for the rest of the day she would walk a step slower, speak a word softer, listen a minute longer. Mercy, like precision, loves timing. By late afternoon, small winds had completed their quiet errands. The office exhaled. The sky rehearsed its gold. The corkboard gathered 3 more cards without asking permission. A mirror convinced another shoulder not to apologize for existing. The library lamp discovered the face of a child who had not been expected by any predictive model, the kind of child algorithms misread until a human makes a correction. A father said yes on a Friday. A coat unlearned cold on a Tuesday. A stone remembered a name. A tree pretended to be small while plotting shade. And in the center of all this untelevised consequence, a woman who had never asked the city for anything expensive prepared to spend a fortune in a currency the city rarely honors. The irreversible choice to turn money into a door that never closes once it has been opened. The card waited, no longer an instrument of spectacle or an engine of competence, but a key being carried toward a lock that refuses applause. Maria measured mornings by the sound of water warming in a thin pot, and by a window that kept its promise to become light even when the sky hesitated. She did not own hurry. She rented it, briefly, when the city demanded proof of belonging. Her uniform hung like a vow on the back of a chair that had learned to keep quiet. She folded a square of cloth and slid it into her apron, not as equipment but as a ritual. Order first, then day. The card lay on the table where she sorted coins on Sundays, foreign among the small countries of copper. Its surface reflected her face in fragments, the eye of a woman who had taught herself to notice, the mouth of a woman who had taught herself to say less, the cheek of a woman who had learned where tenderness is allowed to stand. She touched the card the way one touches a sleeping child, steady and ready to withdraw. She did not plan a test. She planned a day of doors. The first door belonged to power that cannot afford to wait. A public clinic woke when the lights found their fingers. Behind a counter, paperwork rehearsed its indifference. In a hallway, worry stood in a line wearing coats that were trying to be seasons. Maria met a nurse whose eyes regarded the world with practical kindness, the kind that places chairs beneath those who will not ask to sit. Without asking to be recognized, Maria opened an envelope and pressed it toward the fund that catches lives just before they fall too far to be retrieved. The envelope contained a number that persuaded 4 surgeries to happen sooner, 2 braces to be fitted before Bones could learn the wrong story, and 1 prescription to be filled before the weekend ended, and a father taught a child the taste of a preventable emergency. The card sang a note no chandelier knows. From medicine she walked to heat. An old building on a tired street clicked and clanked its winter music badly. The boiler had begun to confuse smoke with work. Maria spoke to an owner whose ledger was honest and insufficient, then paid a crew that arrives in vans carrying warmth like engineers carry bridges. A repairman lifted a face shield and met her with the professional gratitude people reserve for those who sign at the bottom of estimates without sighing. Thermostats learned a new number. Radiators resumed their little applause. Upstairs, a woman who had been boiling water in kettles to persuade a room to be kind watched steam retire from its second job, and cried the kind of tears that do not appear on any receipt. The card recorded a furnace's breath and called it a transaction. The third door held hunger the way a bank holds interest, quietly with procedures. A school cafeteria manager kept a list in a drawer, a list of small debts too polite to be reported. Maria erased the column with a sweep of digits that convinced a system to forget. Trays would be handed without extra eyes measuring shame. Pizza would be pizza again, not a discipline. The manager, who had been practicing looking away, allowed herself to look directly at kindness and recognize it without interrogating it. The card weighed less when she left, as if lighter for having carried something heavy properly. She crossed town and entered a laundromat where dignity rotates behind glass and costs quarters that can break a week. She bought a stack of cards and handed them to a woman who knows which families arrive late, carrying the exhaustion of 3 jobs and the smell of kitchens that start when others end. The woman would distribute the cards small and exact and never say from whom. Clothes grow lighter when given permission to become clean without counting. In a church office that knows the calendar of grief, Maria met a priest who kept his voice like a library. She left an envelope not for candles or choirs, but for a ledger marked burials, the place where the poor negotiate with permanence. 3 families would not face a second humiliation. A stone would arrive where mud had tried to write. A name would stand up in weather. The card made no sound any cathedral would acknowledge. Heaven, if it was paying attention, told no one. At noon, she returned to the building where glass has taught sky to obey. In a small closet beside a service corridor, she opened a box marked lost and never claimed. It contained umbrellas, a lonely glove, a tie that had failed its interview, and a letter without an address. She did not take anything. She left inside a package of thick socks and a note that said nothing about weather and everything about feet that stand all day without being asked whether they prefer sitting. She closed the box and felt a private satisfaction bloom where no one could steal it. The 4th door she opened belonged to language. A legal aid office, tired and precise, held the first draft of 3 lives that had been speaking to the country in a voice the country pretends not to hear. Fees that had been the size of a month were paid in the size of a minute. A woman would stop checking the mirror for the face of a man who never deserved permission. A man would sign papers that turned a job into a future. A child would carry to school a secret that grew lighter: we are allowed to stay. The card recorded these lines and did not brag. She bought time next. For weeks of home care for a neighbor whose hands had begun to drop cups gently on purpose, pretending it was a choice to avoid the crash. The neighbor, a teacher retired into a modest loneliness, would learn to enjoy soup again without fear of dropping the spoon. In the evening, a window would show 2 women laughing in a kitchen where the clock had remembered how to be kind. The card learned to pay for laughter in units of hour. She bought repair for a violin whose case had been a house for dust. In a second-hand shop, a man with a bench and a lamp gave the instrument back the voice it had always deserved. He tuned not with a machine but with a small, old belonging. The violin would travel to a child whose hands had started tapping answers on tables, the whisper of a future making noise before it acquired a name. The card translated tapping into tone. At a park where water keeps the city honest, she met a volunteer crew planting small trees, their roots wrapped like secrets. She paid for 6 more and for the watering schedule that keeps hope from being a theory. The crew leader accepted the schedule with relief and without theatrics. The trees stood in the ground like children pretending to be adults until they actually were. Shade began its apprenticeship. Evening approached, and with it the arithmetic of limitation. 1,000 hands had waved quietly at her all day without waving. She could not lift them all. She could lift these. She could place these envelopes in the right corners. She could convince this winter to be less interested in cruelty. A bus sighed its complaint. A child ran with a scarf that behaved like a flag. A man held a bouquet as if practice would help. Lights tried on themselves in windows. She allowed regret to sit beside her on the ride to her next door. The regret not of having done the wrong thing, but of having to choose among beloved wrongs. The last door for the day belonged to study. A night school held 50 adults in one classroom, their faces bright with the stubborn light of second chances. The program that printed worksheets on thin paper had been waiting to replace the printer for 2 years. Maria paid for the machines that make patients reproduce legibly. For the childcare 3 of those students needed to stop leaving early. For the tuition of a woman who had learned math in a language that does not pay well for math. The director tried to ask her name, but the form she used to give did not include a line for that kind of asking. The card ended the day having purchased what money usually refuses, the possibility of mornings that hurt less. She walked home with nothing new in her hands but a small bag of rice and 2 oranges and the knowledge that the weight of what remains always outweighs what is done, and that this ratio, rather than discouraging the courageous, keeps them honest. In a kitchen that understood her, she placed the card back on the table as if returning a borrowed season. Night filled the room like a lesson. She folded her uniform on the chair and placed the square of cloth on top, ready for tomorrow. In the apartment below hers, a baby stopped crying and discovered air. In the apartment above hers, a man laughed into a phone and thereby convinced rent it could behave for 1 more month. Maria lay down and let tiredness collect its debt. Before sleep, she whispered to the ceiling the sentence she has said to every day she has ever worked: "Let me notice what noticing can save." The ceiling, which has seen lives from angles love doesn't, accepted the sentence and held it until morning. And in a penthouse where light performs faces, a man stood by evening glass, unaware that the question he had thrown into the world had been caught by a pair of hands that would never clap for themselves. The day closed its last door quietly, as good days do. Maria woke before the city decided how to look at itself. The clock practiced responsibility. The kettle rehearsed its one song. She held the card and understood that it could become either a weapon or a well. She chose water again. She began at the building where her own week learned fatigue. The basement door complained. The stair rail knew too much about sweat. In a corner where maintenance stored postponements, she ordered a set of heavy bins with wheels and lids that tell rodents their invitations have been revoked, a mop that respects backs, and a rack that admits gravity but not collapse. She paid for deliveries scheduled for an hour when no one could claim credit, and wrote a note that declared the ownership of those who use, not those who order. The card liked being reasonable. From basement to breath, a dental clinic with a heart of stubborn charity had machines old enough to require patience. She paid for a compressor that lets the air behave, for anesthetic that lets memory be kind, and for a cabinet of little brave masks for little brave mouths whose parents do not schedule heroism. In a folder labeled Special Circumstances, she deposited a sum that would convince 3 teenagers to keep their molars, and therefore their future confidence. The card learned to speak the language of enamel. She returned to the laundromat and asked the owner for a month of nights where the back room could be used by the women who clean offices after everyone else sleeps, to nap safely between jobs, to change, to not be asked questions by streets. She paid for locks that honor trust, for a camera that faces outward rather than inward, and for a sign that says closed while meaning welcome to the right people. She left a note with a phone number that belongs to a woman who knows which kinds of emergencies deserve someone to say "I'm coming at 2 a.m. The card grew warm with purpose. In a neighborhood that has learned resilience the hard way, a bodega owner kept a ledger under the counter that recorded bread going out on credit that might never return. Maria paid a portion of the ledger that would startle the owner into an hour of sitting down. She asked only that the receipts not become announcements and that the milk keep being handed to the person who asks with a whisper. The bell on the door rang when she left, small and faithful. From bread to breath again. She visited an apartment where a woman had been sleeping sitting up so that lungs could pretend to be obedient. She arranged through the clinic network a portable machine that teaches air to stay. She paid the rental for a quarter and the training for using it, and she left a bag of oranges and 4 good glasses because water should be given the dignity it deserves. The card learned the weight of air and decided it is not light. Midday asked her to choose and she obeyed with the steadiness of one who has accepted the sorrowful math of good days. She went to a legal advocate whose office had 3 chairs, none comfortable, and paid for filing fees that turn abused courage into documents that courts respect. She bought 3 preloaded phones that can call for help without owing anybody anything. She gave the advocate a list of hours when she herself could be called to sit with a woman in the bright cruelty of waiting rooms. Money can buy chairs. Presence must be spent from the body. She crossed a river that had learned to behave like a boundary, and arrived at a warehouse where a food pantry organized dignity into boxes. She paid for protein that wouldn't apologize, for diapers that respect a baby's privacy, for formula that keeps indecision out of a mother's eyes, for menstrual supplies that return power to those who manage survival monthly. She purchased a freezer that refused to die at inopportune hours. The volunteers blessed her without words. Blessing does not require vowels. Afternoon approached with the long shadow of too late attached to it. She did not permit the shadow to dictate her list. She entered a shop where a cobbler, almost extinct, rescued shoes that still had distances to walk. She paid for repairs for whoever asked next preemptively. She purchased work for the cobbler, who smiled with hands. Somewhere someone's week would end without new blisters. The card added the sound of leather learning to live again. There are purchases that shine and purchases that endure. Maria chose enduring until the card taught her another word: irreversible. She held it like a coin with edges. The city offered her 1,000 small fires and three good wells and one river that cuts through stone until stone understands it cannot remain arrogant forever. She walked toward a door she had considered for years and never tried because to knock is to admit a dream. It was a house that tried very hard not to be called a house. It held 12 beds and a kitchen and a shelf of small books with sentences generous enough to meet the end of a book with grace. It was the hospice where people are taught to let their hands become language for love. Maria had visited as a volunteer on winter Sundays when the afternoon was a cliff and the night was a sea beneath it. She knew the names of the nurses who spoke to fear like librarians guiding a child to the right shelf. She knew the roof complained every spring. The director kept records like a discipline and hope like a habit. Maria asked for the ledger, not the public one with ceremonies attached, but the private one that notices when the pantry went quiet and when the heater pretended poverty. She paid for the roof, the real one with tar and weather, and for the generator that embarrasses darkness when darkness tries to argue with machines, and for a year of linens that turn skin into a memory worth keeping. She created a fund with a name no plaque would display, for last wishes that look small, a tool for a radio in a language someone misses, for strawberries in January because a taste can be a country, for a train ticket that lets a brother arrive in time to say a sentence no one knew they needed to say. The card did not sing, it exhaled. In an office off the main room, a photograph stood on a bookshelf. A man standing beside a factory gate with a lunch pail that had learned loyalty. Maria had seen that face before in a hallway where a framed portrait hung slightly too high. She understood that love, like the city, has neighborhoods that do not speak to each other. She wrote one more check with the card that afternoon, not to buy grief or to decorate it, but to keep the room where grief is taught how to pass through a body without breaking everything on its way. The director, who did not know her surname, thanked her with a sentence that included only verbs. She left the hospice lighter and heavier. Irreversibility has weight, so does relief. Outside, a woman pushed a stroller that contained a child with cheeks that had not yet learned anxiety. Across the street, a man in a suit practiced conviction into a phone and lost to traffic. Maria felt the river of people move around her and made one more decision because something in her had begun to understand that the day still had one door left, the kind that stays open after you stop holding it. She returned to the city's center, where ambition answers only to altitude. In a registry office that turns memory into maps, she purchased a lease on a small storefront 2 blocks from the building where her mornings begin. Not to sell anything. To keep something from being sold. Silence for those who need papers filled without questions. A kettle that always agrees to be a good host. A counter where the pen is never attached by a chain. A shelf of folders labeled not by problems but by promises. Heat, food, rent, work, words. She prepaid the rent for a year and the utilities for the year after, and she hired 2 women who already hold 3 cities together every week to run it 4 afternoons, paying them as if paying attention finally became a salary. She named it nothing. She labeled the door with a single word: open. The card learned how to hold a space that no one will headline. Night tested the edges of the city and found them, as always, stitched with light. Maria carried a final envelope like a patient flame and went to the only house where she had never knocked. The memory of a factory worker stood beside a library of priceless art. The portrait in the hall looked down at her with a candor that paintings rarely afford. She placed an envelope on a table where lilies had been taught to be spectacular and addressed it not to a person but to a sentence. For the scholarship at the trade school where hands are made excellent. Inside, a sum that would turn 5 apprentices into craftsmen, 2 into foremen, 1 into an owner. Not inventors of apps. Inventors of repair. She knew whose name would sit on the line if anyone asked to print one. She wrote, in honor of a man who understood shifts and lunch pails. She left no return address. When she closed the door behind her, the lilies became less important. Regret approached then, not as accusation but as a request to be honored. She had not gone to the shelter on the east side where the roof still pretends the sky is a friend. She had not paid the bill of the woman with medicine that costs the price of a good month. She had not placed a heater in every cold room. She held the regret as one holds a sleeping child, careful not to confuse weight with failure. Regret, properly held, becomes a map rather than a verdict. Home was the size of someone who has always known how to fold space without angering it. The card lay on the table again, no longer a talisman, more like a tool that recognizes its foreman. Maria counted nothing out loud and put the card where it could forget her. In the building, night agreed to be quiet. Somewhere, a new generator cleared its throat. Somewhere, heat negotiated with pipes successfully. Somewhere, a violin returned to a shoulder and decided to live. Somewhere, a hospice roof practiced defiance. Somewhere, a bodega ledger took a day off from sadness. Somewhere, grown-ups unfolded worksheets that did not embarrass a word with missing ink. Somewhere, a child ate lunch as if lunch were simply lunch. Somewhere, the word open became a kind of shelter. And in a glass room where power keeps its bed, a man stared at a row of receipts that did not show what had been bought because what had been bought cannot be photographed. He would not open the envelope on the table tonight. He would pour a drink that performed warmth. He would look at the city as if it might belong to him and feel, for the first time in years, an unfamiliar humility wandering the room, touching the frames, straightening the books, laying a hand on his chest without asking permission. Maria slept with both hands open, as if ready to give in her dreams. The city, tired and blessable, slept with her. The river kept speaking in its old grammar of insistence. Shade rehearsed itself on saplings that were not discouraged by size. A room with 12 beds and a new generator kept the dignity of breath going one more night for people who had decided to practice letting go in a place where letting go is understood. The purchase had been made. Irreversible. Not in marble, not in headlines, not in rings, but in how tomorrow would treat parents and strangers and a man who has never learned to speak softly to himself. The card could be cancelled. The consequences could not. That is the algebra Mercy prefers. And the test, which had been designed to measure other hearts, had already turned and faced the man who invented it. He would discover this not by reading, but by arriving at a door with a single word on it and realizing it was the only door in the city that opened without asking who he was. The morning began with a silence that was not peace but vacancy. Alexander Quinn woke to the kind of stillness that follows a verdict. The penthouse, his museum of precision, looked identical to yesterday, but something had resigned overnight. The air no longer flattered him. The mirrors, once obedient, now returned a face they seemed reluctant to endorse. He stood in front of the glass wall that had been built to remind him of altitude. The city below glittered like a map of conquests, every light a proof of ownership. But the map no longer responded to his pride. It looked suddenly like an anatomy of distance. On the marble table waited 3 envelopes. Elara's, Vanessa's, Maria's. Each identical in weight, each addressed in his handwriting, each a mirror for his soul. He opened Elara's first. Inside, a leather binder embossed with her initials and his. Pages of receipts, folded and ordered with the kind of precision that thinks it is devotion. Dresses, jewels, flowers, cars, charity tables, and an act of filial tenderness tucked between empires of self. The total read like a love letter written in a language money understands. For a moment Alexander almost admired it. He understood the effort, the performance, the illusion of generosity polished until it became indistinguishable from worship. Then something in him shifted. He saw not the purchases but the choreography, the hunger disguised as gratitude, the fear disguised as taste. He realized that every item on that list had been a mirror held up to him, reflecting the man he had trained the world to admire. She had bought what he wanted her to want. That was his fault, not hers. He closed the binder gently, as one closes the eyes of a body that once carried belief. The second envelope, Vanessa's, was thinner. Inside, a simple summary typed on unbranded paper. No signatures, no emblems. Just rows of transactions that did not glitter. Hospital bills settled. Software upgraded. Stipends dispersed. Chairs replaced. Libraries lit. Trees planted. It looked like the spine of civilization, the kind that keeps grandeur from collapsing. He read it twice and something like heat moved through him. Not shame. Not yet. Recognition. Every figure represented an improvement that no guest would ever praise. Every number a kindness he had never thought to consider because kindness to him was always public. He thought of Vanessa's face, measured, efficient, always standing at a polite distance from his moods. He had mistaken her caution for calculation. He had never understood that discipline is love trained to survive disappointment. He set the paper down, realizing that she had passed his test by ignoring it. Generator Hospice Wing. Scholarship Fund Trade School in memory of A. Quinn Sr. Then came the last envelope, Maria's. He hesitated before touching it, as if the paper might be hot. It was heavier than it should have been. Inside was a list, no formatting, no totals. The writing leaned slightly to the right, disciplined but human. Handwritten. He read the first line. Roof repair, St. Matthew Hospice. Then, burial funds, unnamed. School lunches. Legal air machine. 6 saplings. A storefront, prepaid 1 year, sign reads open. He stopped breathing somewhere between hospice and open. The list continued. A violin restored. A bodega ledger erased. 3 weeks of home care for Mrs. Levin. That last line paralyzed him. His father's name. Written in the hand of a woman who had no reason to know it. The room tilted. He sat because standing felt dishonest. The ink on the page seemed alive, letters trembling with warmth. No grand totals, no flourish of zeros. Just the geometry of compassion. She had turned his fortune into a quiet rebellion against the mathematics of selfishness. He turned the page over. On the back, a single sentence in her careful handwriting. Sir, money is loud. Mercy is silent. I hope you can hear this. He read it aloud once, and the sound left something trembling in the air. Felt like confession. The glass wall that once divided him from the city now looked transparent in a different way. He could see not just the view, but the truth beneath it. Those endless lights were not proof of empire. They were a map of needs he had never visited. He walked to the balcony and stared down at the streets he owned. The wind rose to meet him, cold and objective. He thought of his father's sentence, the one that had haunted his adulthood. When you learn what money can't fix, you'll understand what wealth is. That last line paralyzed him. His father's name. Written in the hand of a woman who had no reason to know it. The room tilted. He sat because standing felt dishonest. The ink on the page seemed alive. No grand totals, no flourish of zeros. Just the geometry of compassion. She had turned his fortune into a quiet rebellion against the mathematics of selfishness. He turned the page over. On the back, a single sentence in her careful handwriting. Sir, money is loud. Mercy is silent. I hope you can hear this. He read it aloud once, and the sound left something trembling in the air. Felt like confession. The glass wall that once divided him from the city now looked transparent in a different way. He could see not just the view, but the truth beneath it. Those endless lights were not proof of empire. They were a map of needs he had never visited. He walked to the balcony and stared down at the streets he owned. The wind rose to meet him, cold and objective. He thought of his father's sentence, the one that had haunted his adulthood. When you learn what money can't fix, you'll understand what wealth is. That last line paralyzed him. His father's name. Written in the hand of a woman who had no reason to know it. The room tilted. He sat because standing felt dishonest. The ink on the page seemed alive. Letters trembling with warmth. No grand totals, no flourish of zeros. Just the geometry of compassion. She had turned his fortune into a quiet rebellion against the mathematics of selfish. Page over. On the back, a single sentence in her careful handwriting. Sir, money is loud. Mercy is silent. I hope you can hear this. He read it aloud once, and the sound left something trembling in the air. Felt like confession. The glass wall that once divided him from the city now looked transparent in a different way. He could see not just the view, but the truth beneath it. Those endless lights were not proof of empire. They were a map of needs he had never visited. He walked to the balcony and stared down at the streets he owned. The wind rose to meet him, cold and objective. He thought of his father's sentence, the one that had haunted his adulthood. When you learn what money can't fix, you'll understand what wealth is. It arrived now, not as a prophecy but as an explanation. He imagined Maria in her small apartment, folding her uniform with reverence, unaware that she had redefined an empire. He imagined her walking into those rooms he had never entered, the clinic, the hospice, the school, and spending his power on lives that would never learn his name. He imagined his father watching, somewhere beyond ownership, proud not of the man, but of the fact that his last lesson had found its way to the right student. The city changed color under him. He realized that everything he owned was made of glass, and glass, by nature, exists to break the moment someone finally needs to reach what's inside. He poured himself a drink he did not want. The ice cracked and the sound startled him. He set it down untouched. For the first time in years he felt the luxury of being small. He took the 3 envelopes and carried them to the study. Side by side, they told the story of his life. The woman who desired him. The woman who served him. The woman who saved him. He opened a drawer and took out the folder that contained his will. He removed it, and with a pen whose weight had always pleased him, he began to rewrite the document. He removed names that had memorized him for his fortune. He added none that expected it. Instead, he created a trust, a silent one disguised as anonymity, devoted to repairing the city one invisible kindness at a time. He wrote, "In honor of Maria Alvarez, who understood wealth better than I ever will." He signed it, dated it, and sealed it. The act felt like exhaling after years of holding breath. Outside, thunder rehearsed itself. Rain arrived like an uninvited truth, washing the glass until the skyline blurred. He watched the blur and realized how beautiful imperfection can be when it refuses to apologize. For years he had mistaken control for peace, precision for meaning, distance for safety. Now he understood that the richest moments in life were made of proximity and imperfection, the soft chaos of caring. He turned off the lights. The city glowed through the rain like 1,000 quiet confessions. He whispered the word thank you into the dark, not toward the ceiling, not toward the city, but toward the quiet spaces mercy had created in him. Somewhere, blocks away, Maria stirred in her sleep, unaware that the man who once tested her had begun to rebuild his life in her image. He did not sleep that night. Sleep is the privilege of the unexamined. Instead, Alexander sat by the window, watching the city exhale steam into the black sky, every rooftop sending its secrets upward like reluctant prayers. He poured another drink, but the glass remained full. He could not stand the sound of ice anymore. It reminded him too much of cracking certainties. When the first light arrived, sliding between the towers like forgiveness looking for a place to land, he knew what he had to do. He would find her. Not as employer to servant. Not as a man of power to a woman of need. But as a soul that owed another a name. He put on a simple coat. Not the tailored kind that announces a man before he speaks, but one his father used to wear to the factory on weekends. Heavy, dark, honest. His driver asked for directions. He said, "Know where you've been." He wanted to walk. It felt appropriate that his first act of humility should make him feel his own weight. He took the train. No one recognized him in the morning rush. No one bowed, no one smiled too long. He was just another man among the unphotographed, carried along by the tide of the necessary. The train moved through tunnels smelling faintly of rust and decisions. He watched faces. A nurse closing her eyes between shifts, a boy reading a textbook half hidden inside a comic, an old man counting coins with the precision of prayer. Every face looked like a fragment of Maria's list. At the next stop, he stepped out into his car's GPS had never pronounced correctly. The streets were narrower, the air heavier, but the colors were honest. Paint peeling where laughter had lived too long, storefronts humble as truth. He walked slowly, not because he was old but because speed felt like theft here. He found the hospice first. A modest building at the end of a quiet block, where the world allowed endings to happen without audience. The nurse at the reception looked up when he entered. Her eyes carried exhaustion, the soft kind that belongs to compassion's price. He told her his name. It meant nothing to her. It was perfect. He asked about the roof. She smiled faintly, puzzled. "The new one? It's holding well. We had leaks last spring. Then a donation came, anonymous. Fixed everything. Even the generator. It's been a miracle." He asked if she knew who gave it. "No," she said. But whoever it was understood dignity. He walked down the hall and stopped at the door of a room where an old man was listening to a radio. The announcer's voice was static and patient. On the windowsill stood a bowl of strawberries, impossibly red for this season. A note beneath the bowl read, "For Mr. Cole who misses summer." He smiled without realizing it. He recognized her handwriting. He left a check on the director's desk with no name attached, marked simply, "For the rooms that still need roofs." And he reaped the strawberries coming. From there he followed her footsteps like a detective of grace. He found the laundromat where a woman behind the counter said, "You mean the lady who prepaid nights? We still don't know who she was." Quiet one. Small hands. Big work. He found the bodega where the owner held up a ledger and said, "She just walked in, paid half this book and said, 'Don't tell them. Let them think the debt forgot.'" He found the school cafeteria, where a cook wiping her hands on an apron said, "Whoever did it made the children stop whispering before lunch. You have no idea what that means." He walked through the city as if through a living biography written in acts of mercy. Everywhere he went, the air felt slightly repaired. Finally, as evening bent the day toward tenderness, he reached the storefront. The one with the word "Open" painted in modest white letters on the door. The sign was simple, but it glowed faintly in the dusk, as if backlit by intention. He opened the door. The bell above it sang a note that sounded like home. Inside, 2 women were sorting papers, refuge forms, rent notices, job postings, all the architecture of small survival. On a kettle in the corner, water murmured toward tea. He could smell oranges. And there, behind the counter, folding a stack of envelopes with careful hands, stood Maria. She looked up. Recognition arrived slowly, the way dawn approaches after long rain. For a moment, she did not know what to call him. Names are fragile when they've belonged to power. "Mr. Quinn," she of title. Her tone made the name sound human again. He nodded. He wanted to speak, but words are heavy when they've never been used for gratitude. He said softly, "I came to see what money looks like when it finally does what it's supposed to." She smiled, not shy, not proud, just present. "You shouldn't have to come here to learn that, sir," she said. "I know," he answered. "But I did." She invited him to sit. He did, at a small wooden table that wobbled just enough to remind him of humility. A cup of tea appeared before him, its surface steady as confession. He watched her move, not the way employers watch servants, but the way a witness watches truth, afraid to miss even the smallest gesture. "I gave that card to test hearts," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "And you gave me mine back." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "You already had it. You just never spent it." Silence filled the room, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything that words ruin when they try too hard. He asked, "Why the hospice? Why my father's name?" She folded her hands, eyes steady. "Because I used to clean that hospice," she said. "Your father volunteered there once. Long ago. He used to bring sandwiches. Factories break bodies, not hearts." I remembered. The world tilted again. He felt his throat constrict around a history he had inherited but never honored. His father, the man who taught him the weight of honest labor, who died before seeing the empire built on that principle, had already met her once, years ago, in a world that cost less and meant more. Tears came, sudden and unapologetic. He did not wipe them away. Some debts are meant to be paid in salt. Maria placed a small handkerchief on the table. It was folded into a square, clean, careful, familiar. He recognized it. The one she always kept in her apron pocket. She said, "You told me to spend as I wished." "I did. I bought back the world." He took the cloth, pressed it between his hands and nodded. He said, "Then I owe you more than I can count." She smiled. "No, sir. You owe others what I owed them. Pass it on. That's how wealth should travel, hand to hand, not account to account." He stayed for hours. They talked about simple things. Rice prices, the smell of rain, the courage of small beginnings. When he finally stood to leave, he reached into his pocket and took out a small envelope. He placed it on the counter. "This isn't a test," he said. "I believe you," she replied. "Then it will find the right place," he whispered. She nodded once. He turned toward the door, but she called after him, "Mr. Quinn." He stopped. She smiled gently. "Next time don't send the card. Send yourself." The words followed him into the night. The city was alive again, but quieter. The noise had turned to hums of heartbeat he had never noticed before. He walked home without the card, without the armor of his certainty. And as he passed the park, he saw a group of children chasing each other beneath small saplings, their leaves trembling in the soft wind. He looked up at the sky, still learning mercy, and whispered, "Father, I found the lesson." The rain began again, not as punishment but as proof that the city was still alive. And Alexander Quinn, billionaire, heir, architect of precision, finally understood what it means to be rich enough to feel everything. The morning after his visit felt unfamiliar in the best way, like waking in a house that used to be haunted and finding it full of light. Alexander Quinn stood before the mirror that had, for decades, been his most loyal audience. It did not applaud. It simply reflected a man who had returned from exile within himself. For the first time in years, he didn't reach for a tie that proved control. He chose a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled, the fabric creased in ways that refused perfection. He looked less like a billionaire and more like the boy his father had raised to fix broken things with steady hands. Outside, the city was already busy performing its chaos. But he noticed something he had never seen before: the rhythm of necessity, the poetry of motion. Vendors arguing softly with sunlight. Taxi drivers sharing breakfast from a paper bag. A woman laughing alone at a bus stop, head tilted toward hope. He whispered to himself, "This is what money looks like when it's not afraid." That day, Alexander didn't drive to his office. He walked. Past corners where ambition sharpened itself, past glass that pretended to be sky. Every step felt like repentance measured in distance. The doorman of the tower greeted him, surprised by the absence of his car. "Morning, sir. Long walk?" "Yes," Alexander said, smiling. "A necessary one." He took the elevator alone, no entourage, no assistant. The mirror inside returned him not as CEO but as citizen. At the top floor, he stood outside his own boardroom before entering. It sounded different now, less like power, more like weather rehearsing its next storm. When he stepped in, conversation stilled. 9 directors looked up, faces prepared for strategy, not silence. He placed his briefcase on the table, but inside was nothing. No reports, no charts, only an envelope. The same envelope that had once been Maria's. He said, "Before we begin, something has changed. I've seen what our wealth looks like when it escapes us. It's beautiful." No one spoke. Money doesn't understand humility until it's taught. He continued, "We've spent years multiplying value without measuring meaning. That ends today. We are going to build something that survives applause." The board exchanged looks. A language of discomfort. Alexander walked to the window and pointed to the city balance sheet. He said, "The sidewalks, the schools, the hospitals, the hands that make our mornings possible. We've taken from them quietly in the name of efficiency. It's time we give back loudly in the name of grace." One director cleared his throat. "With respect, Alexander, philanthropy is..." He turned. "I'm not talking about philanthropy. I'm talking about architecture. We'll design systems that feed, not feed on. We'll build housing that doesn't expire when profits slow. We'll invest in schools that produce citizens, not consumers. We'll treat compassion as infrastructure." Another voice, nervous, "That's not scalable." "Neither is conscience," Alexander replied. "And yet it keeps the world from collapsing." Silence again. But it wasn't resistance. It was awe. The kind that follows an unfamiliar truth that sounds too right to argue with. He walked back to his chair. From the envelope he drew a single sheet, a blueprint. At the top, "The Open Foundation," he said, "named after a door I found last night. It's not charity. It's continuation." He outlined the plan. A trust for small local repair businesses. Microloans for single parents rebuilding after eviction. Scholarships for trade schools under his father's name. A medical grant for nurses in underfunded hospitals. Legal protection for undocumented laborers. A quiet payroll addition for a guard and driver in the company. A dignity bonus, no paperwork, no announcement. When he finished, he said, "We'll fund it with 10% of all annual profits. Consider it the cost of remembering we exist because others allow us to." Someone finally whispered, "Why now?" He smiled. "Because I was tested," he said, "and failed less than I deserved to." The room did not clap. They didn't know how to. But when they stood one by one, they looked less like executives and more like witnesses. A movement had begun, not around profit but purpose. He left them with a final line. "If we must build towers, let them cast shade for someone else." When he stepped back into the elevator, he felt taller than he ever had. He spent the afternoon walking again. Not as a CEO on inspection, but as a man reacquainting himself with gravity. At the park, the new saplings shivered gently in the breeze. Children ran between them, squealing with a joy that could buy no stock. He knelt, carefully, deliberately, and pressed his palm to the soil around one tree. It was still loose, still learning how to belong. "So am I," he whispered. A boy nearby stopped and looked at him. "Mister, what are you doing?" "Helping the tree stand," Alexander said. The boy frowned. "It already does." Alexander smiled. "Maybe it's helping me." The boy nodded, satisfied, and ran off again. He stayed there a long time, letting the hum of the world replace the noise. Existence continued without him, and that this was grace, not tragedy. By evening, he arrived at the old hospice once more. He wanted to see the roof in the rain. The nurse recognized him from the morning and brought him to the back garden, where raindrops whispered on the new shingles. "It's holding strong," she said. He nodded. "I needed to be sure." He walked inside. An elderly woman in bed smiled faintly when he passed. He stopped. She looked at him with the gentle authority of the dying. "You look like a man who finally stopped trying to own the world," she said. He smiled. "Maybe I'm just renting it differently now." She laughed, the sound small but immortal. Before leaving, he wrote one more line in the donation ledger, "For the sound of roofs in the rain." That night, he went home and wrote a letter, not to Maria but for her. It began, "Dear Maria, today I try to live the way you spend. Quietly. With purpose. Without applause. If I fail, forgive me. I am still learning how to hear silence as instruction. You reminded me that mercy is not subtraction from power, it is its correction. Thank you for returning me to the ground. EQ." He sealed it, placed it in a drawer beside his father's old watch, and exhaled. When he looked out his window, the city did not glitter anymore. It glowed. And he understood that the true miracle of mercy is that healing. Time, for the first time in years, began to walk beside Alexander instead of in front of him. The days no longer sprinted toward profit. They lingered, deliberate, generous, each one carrying a small act of repair. He had not realized how quickly an empire could begin to resemble its architect's heart. When his heart softened, so did the walls. The building that once wore arrogance like marble now began to sound different. Laughter echoed in hallways where silence used to serve as decor. People started staying late, not from fear of dismissal, but from the strange joy of purpose. It began quietly. A janitor, once invisible, now had his name on a small plaque outside the service entrance. The building breathes because of Samuel. No press release. No memo. Just truth hung in daylight. In the cafeteria, meals changed. The chef, who had long cooked what prestige required, was now told to cook what dignity deserved. He did. The food tasted like a building remembering it had a soul. Vanessa noticed first. She studied the company's pulse and saw what had happened. The numbers stayed high, yet the exhaustion had fallen. Profit apparently did not need cruelty to thrive. She walked into Alexander's office one morning, unannounced as equals do, and said, "You've turned wealth into air." He smiled. "I'm just letting it circulate." They sat for a long time, not talking about targets or returns but about rhythm, the new cadence of mercy threaded through business. She said, "Maria doesn't know of what she began." "She doesn't need to," he replied. "Grace works best when it forgets who started it." Weeks later, the open foundation came alive. It had no grand opening, no red carpet, no chorus of cameras. Just a simple press statement that read, "To those who hold up the city, we are here to hold you when you tire." The logo was a door drawn slightly ajar. No motto. No founder's name. Only a telephone number that led to a human voice instead of automation. Applications began to arrive in envelopes soft from handling. A mother asking for a wheelchair that didn't humiliate her child. A baker who lost his oven but not his courage. A retired nurse whose pension dissolved quietly under inflation. Each case was answered not with pity but precision. And everywhere Alexander's money went, it learned to bow. He began visiting the sites in secret, the park, the hospice, the school. He wanted to be there without applause, to witness transformation without being its center. At the park, the trees he had once touched now offered their first small shade. Children laughed beneath them, unaware of their origin story. He sat on a bench and listened to their laughter mix with the wind until both sounded like absolution. At the hospice, a nurse recognized him, not for his name but for his regular visits. "You're the one who always checks the roof," she said. He smiled. "Habit," she added softly. "It's good to see a man care about what won't last long enough to pay him back." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night he visited the storefront again, the one with the white word open that glowed softly even when the lights were off. Inside, Maria sat behind the same wobbly table, sorting papers with the precision of prayer. She looked up as he entered, unsurprised. She had the quiet certainty of those who expect goodness to return eventually. "Mr. Quinn," she said. "Or should I call you Alexander now?" He smiled. "Just someone still learning to deserve his first name." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit then. Learning takes time." He sat, and for a moment they said nothing. There are silences that suffocate, and silences that heal. This one did the latter. "How's the city treating you?" she asked. "Better," he said. "Or maybe I'm just listening differently." She nodded. "That's usually all it takes." He looked around, the kettle, the stack of envelopes, the faded posters about job fairs and scholarships. "You've built a cathedral out of paperwork," he said. Maria smiled. "Faith always needs forms, sir." He laughed softly. "And grace needs accountants. Vanessa told me that." Maria's face brightened at the name. "She's a good woman. Careful. The kind who makes chaos feel planned." He nodded. "She's teaching me balance." He hesitated. She left. Said I wasn't the same man. I told her that was the point. He paused. "I wish her well. Truly. I think she'll find her own mercy someday." Maria nodded. "We all do. Eventually." She poured him tea again, same cup, same wobbling table. The steam curled like something rehearsing eternity. He looked at her hands, small, scarred, sacred. He thought of all the places those hands had built without blueprint. "I created a foundation," he said. "I know," she said. "People talk. Quietly. The kind of talk that makes angels proud." He smiled. "It's yours too." She shook her head. "No. It's everyone's. The moment you put one name on goodness, it starts shrinking." He nodded. "Then consider me its caretaker, not its owner." Her eyes softened. "That's the right word." He took out a small envelope from his pocket, her handwriting now carefully preserved. "I kept this," he said. "The list you made. The last line, money is loud. Mercy is silent. I read it every morning." She looked at him quietly. "Then I don't need to teach you anything more." He smiled. "I still need to learn one thing," he said. "How to keep it alive when I'm gone." Maria leaned forward. "Made anonymity sound holy." "It is," she said. "That's why it lasts." Outside, the rain began again, tracing the windows with patience. They sat there as the city changed hue, two souls, one with wealth, one with wisdom, neither keeping score. When it was time to leave, he stood, placed a folded note on the table and said, "For the next roof you'll fix." She didn't open it. She simply said, "I'll make it reach the right ceiling." At the door he paused and turned. "Maria, do you ever regret anything you spent?" She smiled, gentle and eternal. "Only the days I forgot kindness was also mine to give." He nodded slowly, his throat thick. "Then I suppose we've both paid what we owed." She reached out her hand, calloused, steady, forgiving. He took it. And in that brief clasp of hands, the billionaire and the maid, the entire balance sheet of heaven tilted toward mercy. That night, Alexander walked home again through the rain. He passed the glowing skyline without awe, only gratitude. The city that once mirrored his vanity now reflected his redemption. He didn't see it, but somewhere across the river, under the first of the trees she had planted, a boy sat with a violin, learning a song whose notes didn't yet have names. Each sound rose softly into the dusk, like the hum of grace remembering its composer. There are mornings that don't begin with sunlight. They begin with understanding. That day, the city woke as usual, sirens arguing with birds, buses confessing to asphalt, clocks behaving as if time still required them. But Alexander Quinn woke to something quiet, the version printed in magazines beside yachts, but the kind that comes when guilt has finally finished its sentence. He stood at his window, no longer a spectator of his city but a participant in its breathing. Below, life unfolded without choreography. chaos with compassion hidden in its spine. He smiled, realizing that the world had been merciful enough to let him start over without demanding a ceremony. Forgiveness had arrived disguised as routine. He dressed simply. No watch, no cufflinks, no signature shoes. Wealth had become a whisper. And when wealth learns to whisper, the world listens differently. He took the train again. Same car. Same smell of metal and momentum. But now, every face looked extraordinary in its ordinariness. The janitor reading scripture from a phone, a student asleep against her own determination, a man carrying flowers cheap enough to mean they were real. He felt a swelling affection for strangers, the kind that does not need to be named charity. It was recognition, all of them fragments of a city that had been teaching him what his father meant by decency. He arrived at Open, the storefront that had become the pulse of his transformation. The door chimed and he was greeted by laughter, soft, familiar, the laughter of work that knows its worth. Maria knew volunteers, teaching them how to file forms, how to speak gently to those who arrive afraid. She didn't look like a saint. She looked like a woman doing her job, which is how sainthood hides itself best. When she saw him, she smiled. "Mr. Quinn," she said. He shook his head. "Alexander, please." She nodded, and in that nod, equality settled between them like shared sunlight. He placed an envelope on the counter. "For you," he said. She looked at it, unimpressed in the holy way that humble people are. "Another foundation?" He laughed. "No. A closure. I'm stepping down." Her brow furrowed. "From what?" "From pretending I'm needed," he said. "I've built something that doesn't need me to stand. That's how I know it's finished." He explained how Vanessa would run the company now, how the Open Foundation would belong to its own council, how the profits would move in silence through the city like wind through leaves. He was leaving to travel, not to escape, but to witness what mercy looks like in other languages. She listened without interruption, her expression neither pride nor sadness, just approval that didn't need sound. He said, "I used to measure life by what I owned, then by what I gave. Now I think it's measured by how quietly I can leave without taking anything important with me." Maria smiled. "That's wealth, Alexander. Leaving without shortage." He looked around the room, the flickering light on the kettle, the posters for free tutoring, the line of chairs occupied by the tired but hopeful, and said, "This is the richest building in the city. Not because of the money," in here thinking they've run out of choices, and leaves carrying one. He nodded slowly. He had once believed his purpose was to fund possibility. Now he knew it was to trust it. A week later, the foundation held its quiet inauguration of continuation. No stage, no speeches. Just a group of people, nurses, clerks, janitors, teachers, passing envelopes to one another. Each envelope contained help from an invisible hand, written in the language of respect. He watched from the back of the room as the cycle repeated, giving that didn't require gratitude, receiving that didn't taste like debt. He felt something break open inside him, the final layer of vanity giving way to something unmeasurable. He understood finally what Maria had meant. Mercy doesn't need to be seen. It only needs to continue. When it was over, he stepped outside. Rain was waiting again, patient as grace. He walked without umbrella, the sky washing him clean of everything except purpose. He passed the park, the trees now grown tall enough to remember him, the leaves whispering his name not as a headline but as a memory of humility. He reached the cemetery. The headstone Maria had once arranged stood solid against the wind. He knelt, fingertips grazing the engraved letters of his father's name. "Dad," he whispered, "I think I finally understand the cost of your sandwich." And for in his life, he prayed, not for wealth, not for safety, not even for redemption, but for the endurance of goodness after he's gone. At dusk he returned home for the last time. The penthouse greeted him with silence that no longer accused him. He moved through it like a man touring his own museum, grateful for the artifacts of a former self but ready to leave them behind. He wrote one last note, left on the desk beside his father's watch. "If you're reading this, then the wealth has already moved where it belongs. Remember, riches are numbers but wealth is continuation. Let silence spin the rest." He signed it simply AQ. Then he walked to the balcony, where the city lights shimmered like memories of kindness, and closed the door behind him, not to vanish, but to become part of the unseen machinery of grace he had set in motion. Months later, Maria stood inside the open center as the sun descended across the skyline, washing the city in gold. A new volunteer was sweeping, a kettle murmured its usual sermon, and on the wall hung a small framed note written in Alexander's hand. To those who build quietly, keep going. Next to it, someone had pinned the quote she once wrote him back, the one that changed everything. Money is loud. Mercy is silent. The room smelled of oranges again. A woman came in carrying a letter addressed to the foundation, another donation, another unknown miracle disguised as paperwork. Maria smiled, accepted it, and added it to the growing stack of envelopes waiting to become someone's tomorrow. Outside, rain began to fall softly, stitching the city together one drop at a time. Watching the lights shimmer in the wet pavement, and whispered into the air, he learned. And the city, through its 1,000 windows and unseen mercies, whispered back, so did you. They say wealth measures what you keep, but perhaps it's what you release. A man gave his fortune to test 3 hearts, and learned that love spends itself quietly. He sought proof of goodness, and goodness found him. Because sometimes the richest thing a soul can do is learn how to kneel and call it grace.